In both ancient and modern times, Italy's main source of wealth came from its fertile land. There were no major gold mines in the region, and only small amounts of silver were found. Iron and copper existed, but only in a small area of Etruria, which was too limited to support large industries. The people who lived in places with less fertile land, like the Greeks and Phoenicians, had to turn to sea trade to survive. For Italy, farming was the main industry. In particular, the western coast of Italy had very rich soil, thanks to volcanoes near Etruria and Naples. The Po Valley also had deep, fertile soil from river deposits. It was the tough farmers of the Roman countryside who formed the strong Roman legions. These legions united Italy and later helped Rome control the Mediterranean. When these farmers began to disappear, it led to the fall of ancient Roman civilization. We now know that the ancestors of the Latin people, who later built the Roman Republic, came from north of the Alps. Around 2000 BC, small groups crossed the Alps from the Danube River area and settled in northern Italy's Po Valley. At first, they lived in houses on lakes, and later built villages with protective ditches and water channels. These people were more advanced than the earlier Stone Age tribes who lived in Italy at the time. They were farmers, raised animals, and used strong bronze tools. They also probably divided the land among themselves as private property. The older tribes, who hunted more than farmed, didn't resist strongly. Such people often didn't fight for land. These migrations happened slowly over time, but they had a big and lasting effect. The culture of these early people, called the Italici, remained consistent, and they didn't mix much with other groups. During the Bronze Age, they took most of the good farmland in the Po Valley. Later, in the early Iron Age, 1600 to 800 BC, they also settled in Tuscany and Latium. We can trace their spread by their cemeteries, where they used urns to keep the ashes of the dead, showing they practiced cremation. This was a new custom in Italy. Other similar tribes came later and settled in the mountain areas from Bologna to Lucania. These were called the Sabellic tribes. They were closely related to the cremating groups, but didn't burn their dead. By the 8th century BC, the Sabellic tribes moved down into the plains of Tuscany and Latium and began mixing with the cremating groups. In some places like Rome and the Alban Hills, burial, not cremation, became more common again during the 7th and 6th centuries BC. By the 8th century, most of Italy had been settled by Indo-European farming people. These details are important for economic history because they show how much these people influenced Italy's growth. Since they came with advanced farming skills and shared language, religion, and culture, it was easier for Rome to unite them. It also suggests that these people valued teamwork, avoided rash decisions, and preferred organized government, traits that helped shape Roman society. The land of the Latin plain, as we see it today, is actually quite new. In fact, the last layers of volcanic ash there may be younger than the Egyptian pyramids. This land was formed over a long time, starting before the Ice Ages and continuing through them. Even today, more than 50 old volcano craters can be seen within about 40 kilometers of Rome. Between eruptions, long, peaceful periods allowed forests and wild plants to grow, only to be buried again by more ash. If you look at the train tracks leading out of Rome, you can see layers of black and yellow soil trapped between thick layers of ash and volcanic rock. These layers show that forests once covered the land during quiet periods. So the current surface of the land is not very old. Also, the mouth of the Tiber River has filled with a lot of mud since Roman times. The amount of soil the river has brought down since Sulla's time is similar to what came after the last major eruption. The nearby Sabine Hills have many ancient sites where people lived thousands of years ago, even people from the Old Stone Age. But in Rome itself, and nearby places like the Forum and Grotta Ferrata, the oldest graves likely don't go back further than the Iron Age, perhaps only about 1,000 years before Cicero lived. So the Latin plain itself is quite new, and people only started farming there even later. We know that volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius contains useful minerals like phosphates and potash, which help plants grow. Farmers in the Campania region near Vesuvius don't mind small eruptions, since the ash helps their soil. The ash from the Alban volcanoes had the same good qualities, though some of the nutrients have washed away over time. Still, fresh volcanic ash wasn't good for farming right away. Grain crops need soil that's thicker and richer in natural plant material. Before people could farm this land, wild plants and forests had to grow and break down into humus, which is the soft, rich soil plants love. This process did happen. Ancient stories often talk about forests and sacred groves from early Roman times. Even the ancient writer Theophrastus, in the 3rd century BC, said Latium was still full of trees, with strong wood used to build large ships. He mentioned that the Latin plains had water, laurel and myrtle trees, and large beech trees, big enough for shipbuilding. There were also pine and fir trees on the hills, and the Cercio area was full of oaks and laurels. It's surprising to learn that beech trees once grew in the plains, since now that area is dry and bare, and those trees only grow on the hills. As these forests grew on the mineral-rich volcanic ground, they helped create very good soil for farming. Once the volcanoes stopped erupting and scaring people away, it's clear the region wasn't dry like it is today. Now the grass turns brown in June and only comes back in October. Wheat has to be harvested early, by mid-June. But Roman author Varro said harvest came in July in his time, and summer rain was common back then. This likely wasn't due to big climate changes, but more because of massive deforestation. Back then, the hills behind Latium, like the Sabine and Volscian mountains, were covered with thick forests. These forests held rainwater, kept the ground moist, and caused dew to form at night. But now, with the forests gone, rain quickly runs off the bare rocks and disappears. So when early settlers came into the Latin plain, they cleared some forest to grow crops. These people had already been farming in the Po Valley for centuries. They found the soil rich, though not very deep, and the climate warm and moist, perfect for farming. As expected, the population grew quickly. Ancient sources like Pliny even mention 50 villages in the region. Modern archaeology supports this. The museum at Villa Giulia now holds treasures from 6th century cities like Ardea, Satricum, Lanuvium, Gabii, and others. These finds show a level of wealth and culture no one imagined before. These cities, which later became swampy and sickly by Cicero's time, were once rich. Their rulers decorated themselves with gold and gems from across Europe and the Near East. But this wealth didn't come from trade or crafts made by Latins, at least according to archaeological evidence. It came from the land itself, high-quality soil farmed with great care, which supported a large and growing population, much like today's crowded farming regions in the Po Valley. There are still many signs of the impressive farming work done long ago in Latium. These include remains of drains, tunnels, and small dams, though they are not very well known today. Modern Italian farmers, who often find the land hard to work and not very profitable, wonder how ancient farmers ever made such hard labor worthwhile. One good place to see the complex water drainage systems of that time is near Velitrae. Over 40 years ago, a researcher named de la Blanchère found many small tunnels dug into the soft volcanic rock, called tufa, running downhill toward the Pontine marshes. He called them cuniculi. These narrow tunnels, about 3 feet high and 1.5 feet wide, lie just below the ground surface and follow the slopes of small valleys. At first, de la Blanchère believed these tunnels were made to fight malaria by draining swampy land. But they are only found on hills where water already drains well, and they don't reach the low, wet pontine marshes. He also suggested another theory that makes more sense. The tunnels were created when the population was so large that farmers had to save every bit of land possible. By guiding rainwater into underground tunnels, they reduced soil erosion and protected their farmland, even saving space that would have been lost to streams and gullies. This was an extraordinary effort to protect farmland, showing how important and valuable the land was. People must have been in real need of food to justify such hard work. Similar tunnel systems are found north of Veii, probably built for the same reason. One example is the long rock-cut channel at Ponte Sodo near Veii, which directs a river away from farmland, just to save a few acres for crops. Another example is the emissarium of Lake Alban. This tunnel is over 1,300 yards long and 7 to 10 feet tall, cut through solid rock. It was built to lower the lake level and make room for farming on the crater's inner slope. Even with today's engineering tools, this would be a major task and not seen as profitable. If someone wants to see more, they can take a walk from Marcellina up Monte Gennaro through a steep valley called Scarpellata. Usually dry, this valley floods with strong water after heavy rain, washing away any soil that builds up. Ancient farmers built strong dams in this valley using large, well-shaped stones, many weighing about half a ton. These dams still survive today and are just as well built as the famous stone walls of Segni. And yet, each dam may have saved no more than 1 acre of farmland. After seeing all these amazing efforts, it's clear that farming in 6th century Latium was done with great care and intensity. And since the only tools they had were spades and simple digging tools, we can be sure that each farmer worked a very small piece of land, likely just 2 jugera, about 1.25 acres, which ancient writer Varro said was enough for one family. This means that Latium had a very large population living closely together. Knowing this helps us understand how Latium could raise strong armies that quickly expanded its borders. It also explains why cities like Veii were conquered, why Rome recovered quickly after being burned, and why places like Campania asked Rome for help when under attack by the Samnites. It's likely that, after years of intense farming, the soil became overworked and could no longer feed the growing population. This forced many people to look for new land, and that may be why the Latin tribes began to spread out during that time. We don't have direct records about how Latin society was organized in the 6th century. Roman writers who lived much later tried to guess, but they based their ideas on systems that had changed over time. The best approach is to rely on archaeology, the few surviving parts of the 12 tables, Rome's early law code from the 5th century BC, and the earliest political and social traditions described by reliable ancient sources. We can make some guesses based on the large-scale farming projects mentioned earlier. These big systems of tunnels and dams couldn't have been made by small farmers because the tunnels passed under hundreds of different plots. Also, it's unlikely that small local village communities, if they existed, could have planned and carried out such big projects. It is more likely that rich landowners who owned large areas of land and controlled many workers or tenants were responsible for building them. This idea fits well with what we know from other sources. It suggests that there was a kind of estate-based system in Latium at that time, similar to the manor system in medieval England around the 12th century. In such a system, a wealthy landlord owned the land, and many peasants or tenants worked it. This also helps explain the Roman practice of clientship, a relationship between a powerful man and his follower. The early Roman client had duties very much like a medieval peasant. For example, the client had to help pay his lord's daughter's wedding cost, help pay a ransom if the lord was captured in war, and also fight alongside the lord in battles. It also explains why plebeians were in such a poor social and political position in the early days of Roman history. While early Roman law allowed plebeians to own property, they still had limited rights. They could not be elected to government offices, could not take part in official religious ceremonies, and could not marry patricians because their children might gain patrician status. Also, since the patrician senators could veto decisions, the plebeians' votes were less powerful. The idea of the villa already appeared in the earliest Roman laws. The law called it hortus, meaning a garden or enclosed area. Peasant land, usually just a 2 jugera plot, was called an heredium, meaning an inheritance. This suggests a system where peasants had small personal plots on land mainly owned by landlords. There may also have been a form of shared farmland, similar to the open field system of medieval Europe. Evidence for this is seen in the narrow strips of land given to citizens in Rome's earliest colonies, like Ostia and Antium. We don't know for sure if Latin peasants in the 6th century BC were true slaves, like the Helots in Sparta or Crete. But their situation seems no better than that of the medieval peasants who lived under strict control on manors. These peasants lived in villages near the landlord's villa and the local temple. In many ways, these villages looked like the manorial villages of the Middle Ages. You can see the social gap between classes by comparing the rich graves of nobles in Satricum, filled with fancy jewelry, to the simple huts where nearby peasants lived. There's no real need to reopen debates about whether early Rome once had full community ownership of land or how private property began. There is very little evidence that communism ever existed in Rome. The shared pastures near some Latin towns may or may not be leftovers from earlier times. In the Middle Ages, common land was often created later, not in ancient times. Some scholars, like Mommsen, thought it was important that early Roman law said a man's land should go to his family clan if he died without a will or heirs. But even this may have been a later legal invention. What we do know is that private property rights were already strong by the time the 12 tables were written in the 5th century BC. Also, archaeological finds in the Terra Mara sites of the Po Valley show that the ancestors of the Romans were organized farmers over 1,000 years before those laws were written. So, it's very likely that the Latin people already respected land ownership before they ever settled around Rome. Over 1,000 years before Rome was founded, Egyptian records show that people were already trading and raiding on the Mediterranean Sea. Later, the Amarna letters mention Lycian pirates attacking Egyptian and Cypriot merchants. Even before the time of King Hiram, Phoenician traders were sailing to Spain to get British tin. Probably in the 8th century BC, a group called the Tyrsenian immigrants came by sea from the coast of Asia Minor. After mixing with the native Umbrians, they became the Etruscan people. These newcomers took over several towns north of the Tiber River, from Caere to Volci. A big change in burial customs at Tarquini, from urns to trench graves, shows how sudden and impactful their arrival was. In the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the Etruscans spread quickly. They first settled in areas rich in iron and copper in northern Tuscany, then moved north to the Po Valley, and also south through the Trarus Valley into Campania. Latium managed to stay independent for a while, likely because it was too densely populated to be easily taken. Still, the town of Praeneste, on the edge of the Sabine Hills, was captured to secure the land route between northern Etruria and the Etruscan settlements in the south. Around the same time, Greek colonists also began moving westward. People from Epirus and the western Peloponnese came by ship and founded successful cities in southern Italy. Sparta established a colony at Tarentum. Around 750 BC, settlers from Chalcis in Euboea founded Cumae on the Bay of Naples, which became an important center of Greek culture in central Italy. They also built cities on both sides of the Strait of Messina, such as Naxos, Zancle, and Rhegium. Since Chalcis was located on a narrow strait itself, they understood the value of coastal trade routes. Further north, the Greeks discovered that the Latin and Etruscan peoples already controlled most of the land. When the Etruscans later reached Campania, they found the Greeks already there. Corinth, a major Greek trading city, had already begun setting up trading posts in the Adriatic Sea, and around 735 BC founded the colony of Syracuse. Although Greek cities like Miletus made good money trading in the Black Sea region, the Rhodians chose to settle in southern Sicily a century later, founding places like Gela and Acragas. Around 600 BC, the Phocians founded the city of Marseille in southern France, near the Rhone River, which their ships had already been visiting. Even though the Latins did not directly meet the Greeks at first, they were soon influenced by the arts and craftsmanship that these Greek colonists brought with them from the Aegean world. The Etruscans at first lost touch with their original homeland in Asia. Maybe the entire group had migrated, leaving no relatives behind to stay connected. While their religion and astrology clearly show ideas from Mesopotamia, there is little direct evidence of early trade with the East, except for small items that Phoenician traders had already introduced before the Etruscans arrived. Soon, however, some Etruscan nobles became rich by running large farms worked by peasants, and this wealth began to attract traders from the East. Phoenician merchants, who were being pushed out of their old markets in the Aegean by Greek competition, turned to western lands like Spain, Tuscany, and Libya. The tombs at Caere and Praeneste, close to Rome, contain luxurious goods from Phoenician trade, dated to just after 700 BC. Among the most important finds for early trade history are silver and gold-decorated bowls made by Phoenician artists using designs from Hittite, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian art. There are also carved ivory plates, similar to those said to be used in Solomon's temple, painted ostrich eggs, and many glass beads and scarab-shaped amulets, some real, some Phoenician imitations. Greek traders also reached this coast by the late 8th century, as shown by early Corinthian pottery found in the same tombs. The first examples may have come via Cumae, but soon more items arrived directly from Corinth. As Phoenician goods became less popular in Greek lands, Corinth stepped in to replace them. They copied Tyrian products like textiles, perfumes, and oils, and used beautiful ceramic bottles to hold these items. These have become key indicators for dating sites from the 7th century BC. Corinth's location gave it a big advantage in this growing Western trade. Archaeological discoveries in Syracuse, Cumae, and Etruscan cities like Caere and Tarquini show that Corinth was very successful in this new market. During this entire time, Rome was still just a group of small farming villages. The land in Latium was rich, which helped support a large population. The tribe living there was strong, and the Etruscans couldn't easily cross the Tiber River to move south, except by a narrow road along the rocky Sabine Mountains. The farmers in the Latin plain seemed to avoid contact with Phoenician traders, even though those traders were very active in nearby Etruscan cities. The Romans actually got the word Puni from the Syracusans, who came after the Phoenicians. Latin words related to trade and ship parts also came from sailors from Syracuse and Cumae. Even the early trade from Cumae, which is proven by imported goods found in Corneto, had little impact on Latium. In fact, archaeologists haven't found rich goods like gold, silver, amber, or ivory on early Roman sites, unlike what they've found in places north of the river. A few pieces of early Greek pottery have been found, but this was simple, low-value pottery. These items were probably bought from traders traveling through on the road from Caere to Praeneste and Campania. At the end of the 7th century BC, major changes happened in Italian trade. Phoenician commerce declined quickly, partly because of pressure from the Assyrian Empire in Syria, partly because Greek trade was growing stronger with the help of many Greek colonies, and maybe also because Syracuse, now a powerful trading city, was blocking its rivals. There had long been rivalry between Syracuse and the Phoenicians. Evidence in the Latin language shows that Romans had contact with Syracusans during this time, after Phoenician influence had faded, but before Etruscan control became dominant. Around the same time, excavations at Cumae showed that it had close ties with Syracuse. Also, at the end of the 7th century, Etruscan armies finally took control of Latium. This connected their homeland in the north with their settlements in Campania. Etruscan princes took over some of the Latin villages and likely claimed ownership of the land. In Rome, the separate settlements on the Palatine, Esquiline, and Quirinal hills were combined into one city, which was then surrounded by a stone wall for defense. Rome eventually became the capital for an Etruscan ruler who held power over all of Latium. Kings built palaces and temples to new gods, mixtures of Italic, Greek, and Eastern beliefs. Workers were brought in to build and decorate the growing city, and a harbor was constructed at the mouth of the Tiber River to attract Etruscan and Greek ships. However, it's doubtful that Rome ever became a major sea trade center at that time. Ships back then relied mainly on sails and didn't have the power to go against the strong current of the Tiber. Traders also preferred to land on beaches where they could unload goods directly and sell them themselves. Easier trade locations included the beach near Caere and Tarquinii, or the peaceful river mouths at Satricum and Ardea. So, Rome probably grew more because it controlled key land routes across the Tiber, connecting Etruscan cities like Tarquini and Veii to important towns like Tibur, Praeneste, and many Latin cities. Still, during the time of Etruscan rule, Rome and all of Latium stayed connected to trade in the Mediterranean. Even though the Latins managed to keep their language and basic democratic values alive, this was a period of deep cultural change. Many farming villages became real cities. Markets were filled with traders from Carthage, Sicily, and Massilia. Artists and craftsmen from Phocaea and Corinth worked in Rome, decorating temples, palaces, and tombs. Around 600 BC, the Phocians from Asia Minor, who had lost out to the Milesians in Black Sea trade, founded the city of Marseille. Their goal was to trade with the Celts and Iberians in the west. This was very important for Italy because it kept Western trade routes open and linked Italy to the advanced, artistic Ionian Greeks of Asia. Stories brought back by Phocian sailors about the rich Western cities probably inspired many artists and craftsmen to move to Italy in search of work. The new colony also brought valuable resources. Competing with Phoenician traders, the people of Marseille created a new trade route through Gaul to get British tin, which was essential for Italy's bronze industry. They also brought iron from German and Spanish mines, as well as raw materials like wool and animal skins for Italy's growing cities. The rise in the use of amber jewelry in Etruscan cities at this time shows how far this new trade reached, even as far as the Baltic Sea. At the start of the 6th century BC, there was a noticeable increase in Corinthian pottery and locally made pottery in Corinthian styles at Etruscan sites. Some believe this was due to political problems in Corinth around 583 BC, which caused many important people and their followers to flee. Some of them seem to have settled in Tuscany, where they continued their trades or taught their skills to others. The Roman legend of Demaratus, a Corinthian whose son became the Etruscan king Tarquin of Rome, fits this idea. The Roman Emperor Claudius later said this story was found in very old Etruscan records. A good example of early trade between East and West is found at Naucratis, near the mouth of the Nile. This city has been called the Ancient Shanghai because it was a busy industrial and trade center. The Egyptians, who usually didn't allow foreigners to settle, let Ionian Greeks build a trading post there. The workshops in Naucratis produced goods in new Ionian styles, as well as religious and personal items based on Egyptian culture. Many of these products have been found in Italy, showing strong connections with Greek cities like Rhodes, Miletus, Clazomenae, and Phocaea, which were all involved in Naucratis' industries. Some of the objects found in Italy closely match the art styles of those cities, so there is clear evidence of wide foreign influence in Western Italy, but it's harder to tell who exactly was doing the trading and what roles the Etruscans and Latins played in the economic activity of the time. In the 6th century BC, when the Etruscans controlled Latium, they were at their peak. They ruled western Italy from the Alps down to Campania and had access to trade in the Tyrrhenian Sea. Their wealth mostly came from farming, where local people, treated like serfs, worked the land for them. Some cities like Caere, Tarquini, and Volci were very wealthy, even though they weren't near metal resources or great trade routes. They likely earned money by moving goods from inland to the coast. The Etruscans were also very interested in crafts and industry. Their love for colorful clothes, jewelry, and detailed religious objects helped local industries grow. Even cities without natural resources, like Praeneste, became centers of skilled production. From there, we have found beautiful gold and gemstone jewelry, detailed bronze mirrors, and many household items. Even if the designs weren't always original, the skill in making them was very high. It's often hard to tell if a piece was made locally or imported. Because of this, archaeologists today label many items from this time as Phoenician Etruscan, Ionic Etruscan, or Corinthian Etruscan, depending on their style. A large number of vases were made during this time in Ionian and Corinthian styles, and later in the well-known Attic black figure style. These vases were often decorated with scenes from Greek myths. Sometimes the myths were slightly changed, showing they were made in the West. In building temples, the Etruscans used Ionic and Sicilian styles. Greek architects were likely invited to design them. Since Etruria didn't have much good building stone, they used a lot of wood in construction. To decorate the wooden parts of temples, like beams and roof parts, they added terracotta, baked clay panels with scenes of chariots, hunters, and mythical figures. At first, these panels might have been made by Ionian artists or from imported molds, but over time, local Etruscan artists learned to create their own with great precision. Temples and statues made of terracotta from cities like Veii, Falerii, Satricum, Velitrae, and even early Rome are so finely crafted that they rival similar works from Greece or Asia Minor. During the 6th century BC, the Etruscans also became active at sea. Greek writers, likely upset about the new competition, often called Etruscan sailors pirates. But we can't be sure how accurate that label really was. People often criticize successful rivals, especially if they come from different cultures. Still, the many types of goods found in Etruscan tombs from that time, including Ionian, Athenian, Corinthian, Chalcidian, Syracusan, Cumaean, and Carthaginian pottery show that these items reached Etruria without much trouble. It's unlikely that the Etruscans themselves brought all this Aegean pottery by sea, because Greek authors didn't mention them much. So Etruscan sea trade probably didn't stop foreign merchants from entering the Tyrrhenian Sea. The Etruscans may have been influenced by the Carthaginians in their sea policies. Around the early 6th century BC, Carthage had become stronger by welcoming wealthy Phoenician families who had fled from Tyre due to the Assyrian invasions. Carthage began blocking Greek traders from African and Spanish waters and formed a close alliance with the Etruscans. Around 537 BC, the Etruscans and Carthaginians joined forces to destroy the Phocian colony in Corsica. They later tried to attack Cumae, but failed because Syracuse stepped in to defend it. This suggests that trade in the Mediterranean was becoming divided. Greeks on one side, Etruscans, and Carthaginians on the other. Each group probably tried to limit the other's movements. Greek merchants avoided sailing alone into Etruscan waters, and likewise, Etruscans and Carthaginians didn't often enter Greek-controlled seas. This could explain why Greek trade increased in Adriatic ports, and why goods from Apulia moved along land routes to Cumae. It might also explain why Cumaean goods were carried by land through Campania to Etruria. There's also some evidence of competition between Greek cities themselves. For example, the city of Croton destroyed Sybaris in 510 BC. One reason may have been that Sybaris controlled a valuable land route across southern Italy. This route helped it avoid sea restrictions imposed by other cities like Syracuse, Zonkel, or even the Etruscans. The fall of Sybaris especially upset Miletus, a major Greek trading city, because it had used that inland route to send its goods northwest. Still, we can't say that full trade bans existed yet, except possibly in places controlled by Carthage. Bad relations could lead to occasional attacks on unprotected ships, but overall, the wide variety of imports found in Etruscan areas shows that trade remained mostly open. It would have been nearly impossible to shut down trade across Italy's long and open coastline, especially since inland cities relied on many land routes to reach markets. Based on the goods found at Etruscan sites from the 6th century, we can imagine the trade situation like this. Carthaginian ships likely had open access to Etruscan ports due to agreements like the early treaties described by Polybius. This trade connected Italy mainly to Africa, Spain, Britain, and to a smaller degree, Syria and Egypt. The Etruscans had an active coastal trade, traveling to places like Marseille, Cumae, and the Sicilian Straits. Since they didn't often enter Greek waters, they probably picked up Greek goods at the ends of land routes, in towns like Laos, Temesa, and Medma, or in Sicilian ports and Cumae. Greek merchants from Corinth and Ionia could unload their cargo in southern Italy and Sicily, where it was transferred further. The Phocians sailing to Marseille likely stopped at Etruscan ports, and Syracuse handled a large share of coastal trade during this period. Because of its powerful navy and key location, Syracuse was able to distribute Athenian goods northward, even before Athens became a major trading power itself. Latium, including Rome, was not a major sea trading power during this time, but it still took part in the growing trade network. Rome had grown so much in population that traders were surely drawn to its markets. Also, several important land routes from Etruria, Campania, Latium, and the Sabine region all crossed the Tiber River at Rome. Ships also stopped at ports near Ardea to trade with the Rutuli people and the towns in the Alban Hills. They especially traded at the mouth of the Astura River near Satricum. This town was the end point of a major road that connected to Velitrae, Norba, and Praeneste, and also to the mountain tribes of the Hernici, Volsci, and Equi. Since trade involved exchanging goods of equal value, Latium must have offered its own products in return for foreign goods. But it's not easy to say exactly what these local products were. Rome may have had a small part in the metalworking industry that was well known in nearby Praeneste. Plutarch mentions that there were groups of gold and copper workers in Rome during the time of the kings. The area called Vicus Tuscus in Rome might have gotten its name from Etruscan craftsmen who settled there. The famous bronze statue of the Catiline wolf, which is still one of Rome's most important ancient treasures, appears to be a masterpiece of Ionian Etruscan art from the 6th century BC. If it was made in Rome, it shows that skilled metalworking was happening there. Grain, Latium's main crop, was probably not exported much by sea, since ships back then were too light to carry heavy loads. But the Latins could trade their grain with the mountain tribes in exchange for things like wool and animal hides, which could then be exported. It's also possible that grain was traded for copper from cities north of the Tiber River, and that copper was then used to pay for imported goods. In fact, the Latin word nummus was used in Sicily, suggesting Latium was exporting copper. The Sicilian word for pork also comes from the Latin arvina, which suggests the early Latins raised enough pigs to trade pork as well. Right after Rome got rid of its Etruscan kings and became a republic, we have one of the oldest commercial treaties in Western history, a trade agreement between Rome and Carthage, recorded by the historian Polybius. This treaty gives us a better idea of how trade worked in that time than the broken pottery we often rely on. It said, "There would be peace and friendship between Rome and its allies, and Carthage and its allies. Roman ships could not sail west past a certain point on the African coast, unless bad weather forced them to. If they did, they could only stay briefly, buy what was needed to repair the ship, and leave within 5 days. In Libya or Sardinia, Roman merchants could only trade in the presence of official Carthaginian representatives. The state would guarantee the payment. Romans who arrived in Carthaginian parts of Sicily would get the same trading rights as others. Carthaginians were not allowed to harm Latin towns under Roman control. They also had to avoid harming Latin towns not under Roman control, and return them to Rome if they captured any. They could not build forts in Latium or stay there overnight with weapons. This treaty shows that organized international trade and diplomacy were already well developed in the Western Mediterranean by the end of the 6th century BC. Unlike in Homer's time, when travelers were often seen as pirates, this treaty reveals a more orderly and legal approach to trade. It also shows how much more powerful and experienced Carthage was than Rome at this point. Carthage clearly created the rules, and most of the treaty favors Carthage. It's unlikely that a stronger trading nation would have accepted such terms. Also, the rules limiting Roman ships probably weren't based on real Roman trade in Numidia, but rather on Carthage's usual policy of controlling sea routes, or possibly based on what Etruscan-controlled Rome had done before the Republic was formed. This treaty doesn't mean Rome had strong trade after the kings were removed. In fact, the fall of the monarchy likely caused many traders and craftsmen to leave. The new Roman Republic focused more on land than sea, and in the 5th century BC, foreign merchants visited Latium less often. Carthage didn't even offer Rome another trade deal until the 4th century, after Rome founded the port city of Ostia and began showing more interest in trade. Even that later treaty shows that Rome still lacked the power to demand fair trade terms. The document also proves that Carthage was trying to control the seas, mare clausum policy. They kept the coasts of Numidia and Mauritania for themselves, probably including the Strait of Gibraltar. This was easier for them because the desert protected them from attacks inland. Sardinia and Libya were not yet fully closed off, likely because Carthage didn't yet have a big enough navy to enforce total control. But in both regions, local officials were already watching over trade to protect Carthaginian interests. Only western Sicily was open to all traders, because it was too hard to block completely. Meanwhile, Rome's port remained open to all peaceful traders. This was probably the usual policy of Italian cities, including under Etruscan rule. The fact that Carthage was able to sign a treaty with Rome right after Rome broke free from Etruscan rule also shows that the earlier Etruscan-Carthaginian alliance had not completely locked other traders out of the Tyrrhenian Sea. As discussed before, with Italy's many land routes, trying to close the sea would not have worked anyway. In the end, this treaty shows two important things. Carthage was a powerful trading empire that wanted to control as many sea routes and markets as possible. Rome, though it may have had some past experience in trade, was now more focused on protecting its land and keeping its ports open to lawful foreign visitors than on becoming a sea trading power. The 6th century BC ended with a major change. The Etruscan kings were removed from power in Rome. But this wasn't just a national movement to free Rome from foreign rulers. We know this because many of the new leaders still had Etruscan names. It also wasn't a full democratic revolution. The new government was controlled by a small group of wealthy families. Still, this event started a long conflict between the patricians and the plebeians, who paid taxes and served in the army but had few rights. The struggle lasted for 2 centuries. It involved a lot of legal arguments, negotiations, and compromises, showing how Romans preferred to solve problems with laws rather than violence. Only the English, in later history, went through a similar kind of peaceful revolution under pressure. Some modern historians say this conflict was mostly political, and that ancient sources, especially Livy, were influenced by later times, like the period of the Gracchi. But even if Livy exaggerated the economic side of the story, the laws that came out of this struggle clearly show that economic issues were a major cause. Early Roman society was based on a system of social classes, and those classes were closely linked to wealth. Before the revolution, most Roman farmers were probably semi-free peasants. We don't know if they were actual serfs, because there's no mention of a formal freedom of the serfs in the records. Some historians believe that when the plebeian tribunes were first created in 495 BC, it may have been a way to protect or liberate these peasants. If peasants had been in bondage, the change may have been slow and not recorded in law. It's possible that the Etruscan kings had supported the peasants to weaken the power of the nobles and keep their own control strong. Or the nobles might have given up some of their privileges during the revolution to gain the peasants' loyalty against the king. Similar things happened during the decline of feudalism in medieval Europe. In any case, there's no clear sign of serfdom in the early Roman Republic. The Servian constitution, although it gave more power to the rich, still assumed that many soldiers in the army were small landowners, free men. Whether they were technically free or not, Roman peasants lived in hard conditions. Their farms were small and getting less productive. The big land clearing projects we read about earlier suggest that the land was being pushed to its limits to feed a growing population. The soil was worn out, and Livy often mentions famines and food shortages during the 5th century BC. If these peasants had only recently received land, they would have had little experience and faced serious financial problems on their own. At the same time, very harsh debt laws allowed creditors to turn debtors into slaves or sell them abroad. So if peasants demanded help, as Livy says, that would be understandable. And if they asked for more legal rights and political power, it was probably because they saw that civil equality could lead to a better life. Some poorer people living in the cities also joined this struggle. When the Etruscan kings ruled, Rome had become a hub for trade and industry. Many workers, like metalworkers, builders, and shopkeepers, had moved to the city. They produced jewelry, pottery, tools, weapons, and building materials. Commerce also created jobs at the docks, in transport, and in shops. Many of these people lost their source of income after the kings were expelled because Rome was cut off from Etruria and its trade networks. Very few imported items have been found from 5th century Rome, and its port at Ostia seems to have fallen into disuse. With many workers left jobless, a restless urban lower class emerged, ready for protest. A law in 456 BC gave these people small plots of land on the Aventine Hill. This may have been an attempt to calm them. Also, the creation of the first 4 tribunes of the plebs might have been intended to replace the king's protection for these poorer citizens. Livy connects the first plebeian protest with the Latin wars that happened after the monarchy was overthrown. Although Livy had no direct sources for the causes, his guess makes sense. This was a time of change for both Romans and Latins. The Roman Republic had replaced the kings, and the Latin tribes also wanted more independence. The first treaty between Rome and Carthage suggests that under the kings, Rome had controlled much of Latium up to Terracina. The new republic tried to keep that power, but it was too weak to do so, especially after losing support from Etruria. The Latin tribes wanted to return to their earlier freedom. When Rome refused, they went to war and eventually won more equal status in a new Latin league. According to Livy, it was during this war that Rome, needing more soldiers, called up the plebeian farmers. In exchange, the plebeians demanded the right to choose representatives, tribunes, to protect their interests in the government. The creation of the tribunes was a unique system and tells us a lot about the problems the plebeians wanted to fix. At first, there were probably 4 tribunes. They were considered sacred, meaning the plebeians forced the government to promise not to harm them. Breaking this promise would bring divine punishment. This shows that the plebeians had become a separate group in society and had gained power by using a kind of general strike. The early tribunes didn't have normal government powers. Their authority was personal. They helped individuals, especially within the city walls. Their job was to defend poor citizens, especially those who were at risk of being sold into slavery for unpaid debts. A tribune made sure the person had time to seek help from friends or family. So the tribune system started as a way to fix economic injustices. But once the tribunes were organized, they quickly expanded their power. When plebeians gathered to elect tribunes, they also began discussing new ideas and giving instructions to their representatives. Over time, they became more organized and used their unity to pressure the government. In 452 BC, the tribunes forced the government to write down the laws so that judges couldn't make unfair decisions and reforms could be made more easily. A few years later, they won a new rule. If the plebeians passed a plebiscite, a public vote, the legislative assembly had to consider it as a law. Eventually, marriage between patricians and plebeians was allowed. In 393 BC, Rome gave all citizens 7 jugera of land taken from Veii, a nearby conquered city. This act was very important. It showed that the plebeians had gained real political power, and it also helped many poor people become landowners, giving them more influence in Roman politics and a better chance at economic success. Later, in 366 BC, a new law called the Licinian Sextian Law allowed plebeians to be elected as consuls, the highest officials in the state. The same law also limited the amount of public land any one person could rent to 500 jugera, giving the poor better access to land. By 287 BC, the plebeians achieved full political equality. They passed a law that said the tribal assembly, which voted by neighborhoods, had the same legal power as the assembly that voted by property class. They even invited patricians to join the tribal system. In doing so, the plebeian movement became the Roman state itself. From then on, tribunes could call public meetings and lead votes that decided Roman policies. This was a huge success. If Rome had stayed a small city, this system could have become a true democracy, like some Greek city-states. Let's look again at the land distribution in 393 BC, when 7 jugera from Veii were given to every citizen. For the rich, this small land wasn't very useful. They probably sold or rented it. But for the poor, this amount of land was enough to make a living in a time when farming was done by hand and fields were carefully maintained. The Roman state now had loyal, land-owning citizens to rely on, which helped it stay strong during difficult times. This also helped Rome avoid problems seen in other societies, like wealthy absentee landlords who didn't care about the land, tired tenant farmers who didn't work hard, slaves who had no motivation. Romans knew that small farmers weren't always efficient or innovative. A skilled farmer like Cato, trained in Greek and Carthaginian farming methods, could get better results by choosing crops wisely and focusing on larger farms. Like later thinkers in Renaissance England, he believed it was more profitable to consolidate farms. Also, dividing the land from Veii into small plots made it impossible to maintain the drainage tunnels that had once helped large farms. If one small farmer didn't manage their part of the water flow, the entire system failed. With no coordination between landowners, the tunnels fell into disuse, and total agricultural production dropped. Still, maximum economic production was never the main goal of Roman government policy. The Roman Senate usually thought about its citizens in terms of military and political needs, not just economic growth. The more democratic parts of the government cared about social improvements too. For a small and vulnerable state like early Rome, it was very important to have an army made up of loyal, land-owning citizens. These citizens would want to protect the state because their own property and future depended on it. This idea shaped Rome's military system for centuries. It was also important to have a large group of self-supporting citizens who were satisfied with their lives and trusted the government, especially during elections. These were common ideas in Rome. Most Roman leaders preferred small landowners over large landlords because they believed the small landowner system was better for social stability and democracy. If big landowners eventually took control, it wasn't because the Senate didn't understand the problem. It was because economic forces were too strong, and the tools they had to fix the situation weren't enough. Still, this system of giving land to poor citizens helped Rome in many hard times. It helped Rome recover from the Gallic invasion. It helped avoid violence during the long class struggles. It gave Rome the strength to survive Latin rebellions. It laid the foundation for the flexible political system that allowed Rome to unite Italy into a strong federation. In short, land distribution helped turn poor people into stable, responsible citizens who cared about their country. So far, we've talked about the plebeians' civil rights, mainly in connection with land and farming. But near the end of this period, a new economic issue came up. Rome began using coins, which disrupted the old, stable economic system based on barter. We don't know exactly when Rome started making coins. Some Romans said Servius Tullius created the mint, but art historians believe the first Roman coins were made in the 4th century BC. These early coins had a picture of a ship's prow, which may be a reference to Rome's new port city, Ostia, founded around the middle of that century. Right after coins appeared, Rome faced new financial problems. In 352 BC, a bankruptcy commission was set up. In 347 BC, the legal interest rate on loans was cut in half. In 342 BC, charging interest at all was banned. These laws suggest that the government, inexperienced with money, was trying to fix problems caused by sudden inflation. For a society used to barter, the sudden use of coins may have caused prices to rise, made borrowing easier, and led to many business failures. This situation probably led to the financial crises described by Livy. The laws passed during this time show that the lower classes were gaining political power. Just 3 years after interest was banned, the plebeian leader Publilius Philo passed a law that took away the Senate's power to block new laws. However, leaders later realized that banning interest made things worse. The old interest rate came back into use soon after. And when Rome started winning new lands in Latium and Samnium, the extra money in the economy was used up through colonization. This helped bring the financial system back into balance. The hard work Romans put into saving small pieces of farmland from erosion shows that there were too many people living on the land and that the soil was getting weaker. This problem was especially serious in Latium for several reasons. First, the soil in Latium hadn't had much time to form. In many areas, especially on the lava ridges around the Alban Hills, the ground was so hard that almost no real soil could develop. In some places, if you scratched the surface, you would hit lava right away. Plowing there was nearly impossible. Some areas were better. Ash and soft volcanic stone could grow plants with strong roots if there was enough humus and nitrogen in the soil. But even in those places, the soil layer was thin and fragile, especially outside of river valleys. Worse still, the volcanic ash had fallen in uneven layers, forming hills and mounds instead of flat plains. When Roman farmers cut down trees and cleared grass for farming, the thin soil was exposed. Rain in winter easily washed it away. That's why farmers tried so hard to channel rainwater into underground drains. They were trying to save the surface soil, which was precious and limited. But even with all that effort, the soil wore out, erosion continued, and farming declined. As a result, many once prosperous villages began to suffer. A similar situation happened in central Pennsylvania in more recent history. There, settlers farmed thin soil above sand. After a century of overuse, the land became useless, and people abandoned their farms. Latium didn't get quite that bad, because the deeper soil there was still fairly rich, even if hard to reach for crops with shallow roots. But based on the constant reports of poverty and hardship in Livy's early Roman histories, the 5th and 4th centuries BC were clearly hard times. Another problem was deforestation. Cutting down too many trees meant less rainfall and more dryness in summer. Forests had helped hold in moisture, but now they were being cleared for farming and to provide timber for trade. In fact, Latin wood was exported as far as Greece, which by then had few trees left. In the Volscian Mountains, cutting too many trees led to disaster. Rain washed away the soil, filled up the rivers with mud, and turned the rich farmland below into swamps full of disease. Once thriving cities like Norba, Cora, Setia, and Privernum became small villages. The same happened in the Sabine Hills, where once green mountains turned into bare rock. Rain became rare, summers got longer and drier, and whatever rain did fall rushed off into the sea. Latium slowly became the dry region we know today. As conditions worsened, farmers looked for solutions. One problem was a shortage of manure. Because all land was used for crops, people didn't raise many cattle, which were needed to produce fertilizer. Beef wasn't eaten much, and horses weren't commonly used either. Eventually, farmers with worn-out soil stopped growing crops and planted grass for pasture instead. This helped keep the remaining soil in place. Some farmers started keeping oxen for work, and the wealthy landowners in the cities bought some of the meat. Sheep were raised for their wool, often traded from nearby mountain areas. Goats were kept for milk and cheese. But there was a big problem. From July to September, there was no grass, so shepherds had to cut tree leaves to feed the animals. This was a lot of work. In the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, when Rome took control of nearby mountain pastures in the Volscian and Sabine hills, farmers began using mountain pastures in summer and lowland pastures in winter. It's unclear whether the Latin landowners started this practice, or whether shepherds from the hills came down to use abandoned farmland in the Campagna. But once the idea caught on, landowners quickly took advantage of it. Land that could no longer grow grain was now used profitably for grazing animals. The first records of large numbers of Roman slaves working as shepherds come from the Second Punic War. But since these records are rare, the practice probably started earlier. Even today, during early July, sheep move from Rome toward the mountains, just as the poet Horace described. Now the shepherd with his tired flock looks for shade. This shift to animal farming had serious effects. Raising sheep and cattle required money, especially if you needed land in 2 places. A rich man could easily keep hundreds of sheep with the same number of workers needed for just a few. So small farmers couldn't keep up. Wealthy landowners started taking over more land, and a kind of enclosure movement began. Fields once used for crops were turned into large pastures. Since raising animals didn't take much skill, landowners bought slaves to do the work. Where once 100 peasant families lived and farmed, now a few foreign slaves managed huge estates. The population of the countryside shrank rapidly, and the Campagna became empty. Another industry also pushed farming out of the Alban hills. The land here had lost soil quickly because the slopes were steep. But people found that while weak crops like wheat and barley could no longer grow, grapevines and olive trees could still survive. These plants could grow well even in the soft volcanic rock and ash. Farmers simply had to dig into the tufa, crush it, and plant the vine or tree roots deep in the ground with a bit of good soil. Once the plant became strong, it could feed itself from the poor soil where other crops failed. Since grape and olive farming takes years to become profitable, this industry was mostly started by rich landowners who could afford to wait, about 5 years for wine and up to 15 years for olives. Some people say that Rome destroyed farming in Latium when it took over Sicily during the First Punic War, because cheap Sicilian grain entered the market and made it hard for Latin farmers to compete. But that's unlikely. The Roman elite, who controlled the state, wouldn't support something that hurt their own economic interests. It makes more sense to say that by the middle of the 3rd century BC, Latium had already stopped being a good grain-growing area, and many landowners had already switched to vineyards and olive trees. In this case, Sicilian grain simply met a growing need. All these big changes, from the 5th to the 2nd century BC, took place slowly over time. They also meant that a lot of people had to move around because population was dense in the earlier centuries. In ancient Greece, a similar problem caused many people to leave and build colonies elsewhere, or shift to trading and industry, which transformed cities like Athens and Corinth. Rome chose a different path. Romans did not emigrate or start a strong industry. Instead, they turned to conquering new lands. There were early signs of interest in trade, like the building of Ostia and laws by Appius Claudius, but that wasn't Rome's main direction. Instead, Rome's extra population found space through military expansion, especially after the plebeians gained the right to become consuls in 366 BC. In 343 BC, Rome helped the Campanians fight off Samnite invaders, won the war, and got new land in the north of Campania for colonization. A year later, the Latins rebelled, but after being defeated, they were added to the Roman state. Some became full citizens, others got partial rights. Some of their land was taken and settled by Romans. In 328 BC, another war began with the Samnites, and it eventually pulled in Etruscans, Umbrians, and Sabines. For nearly 40 years, central Italy saw constant war. This was followed by the war with Pyrrhus, and Rome's victory made it the leader of a federation that stretched across Italy. This era of expansion followed a time of overpopulation and demand for land. Many historians believe that land hunger was the main reason Rome grew territorially. That might be true. Agricultural societies often expand when they don't have enough farmland. And like other nations, Romans could become aggressive toward neighbors if they needed more food. Still, we shouldn't explain everything with economic theory alone. It's important to remember that Romans had a strong sense of justice and property rights, developed over centuries of defending their farmland. That's one reason their civil laws later became a model for many other societies. Also, when we look closely, we see that Rome didn't act like a greedy land grabber. After victory, they usually took some land as compensation, but didn't give large estates to settlers. Most land was divided into small plots, just big enough for a home and military post. Also, they included some local allies in the new colonies to keep the peace and create unity. In the 4th century BC, Rome began to create new settlements, but the goal was not just to give land to citizens, it was to protect the state. The first colonies were set up at Antium and Tarracina, coastal towns that were often attacked by pirates and enemy fleets. Only about 300 men were sent to each, probably just enough to control the area and defend the ports. Each man got only a small piece of land. Other settlers were sent to Privernum, near the Volscian Mountains, but this land was swampy and had a high risk of malaria, so it was not very valuable for farming. The reason for choosing these places was military, not economic. A larger colony was set up at Cales, in land taken from allies of the Samnites. About 2,500 people settled there, including both Romans and allies from Latin and Campanian cities. Cales was a typical Roman colony on the border. The land was good enough to live on, but more importantly, it was in a strategic location, between Rome and Capua, and it blocked the Samnites from reaching other areas. Other colonies were placed at Luceria, Suessa, Interamna, and Alba, all chosen for military reasons. Another example is the Falernian fields, rich farmland taken from people who had helped Rome's enemies. Although the land was excellent, Rome sent settlers 100 miles away, which shows that military needs were more important than farming. These settlements reflect Rome's strategy throughout the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. In the 3rd century, fewer Roman-only colonies were created. Instead, Latin colonies became more common. In some areas, like the Ager Gallicus, Rome struggled to find enough people willing to settle. This shows that Rome didn't have a land shortage anymore, but rather a shortage of settlers. It's hard to say exactly how much Rome's expansion was caused by economic problems, but there's a clear connection. The overpopulation in Latium and the decline of the soil likely pushed the state to take action in 343 BC. Rome's large population gave it the ability to build a powerful army, which made conquest easier. But as wars continued, the population shrank, and the need for military colonies took away the surplus of people. By the 3rd century, Rome had fewer people, not more. Still, the Roman government always focused on political and military goals, not just the needs of poor citizens. However, Rome's expansion did change its economy. With so much new land to settle, people didn't feel the need to try new jobs, develop crafts, or start trade businesses. Rome turned away from foreign contact. In earlier times, Rome built Ionic-style temples under Greek influence. But by the 4th century, this influence had faded. The stone buildings from this time show that Rome had stopped following Greek artistic trends. Roman architecture didn't catch up until the 2nd century. In crafts, the same pattern appears. The nearby city of Praeneste, for example, developed very skilled silver workers in the 3rd century. But Roman artisans of that time did not match their skill, even though both cities were Latin. The reason might be that Praeneste, after a treaty with Rome, had limited land and had to focus on crafts and industry. If Rome had faced similar limits, maybe it too would have become more creative and skilled in art and trade. But because Rome kept expanding, its citizens always had the chance to move to new land or invest in property. As a result, they became landowners and farmers, not artists or businessmen. And since necessity often drives people to develop new skills, Rome's easy access to land may have prevented it from becoming a center of industry or trade. The history of Roman coin-making shows one of the most interesting examples of financial experimentation in the ancient world. Rome tried to create a good currency system using very little gold, which was rare in early Italy. They also wanted a type of money that would be accepted in international trade and could compete with the many coins used in nearby cities. At the same time, they tried to keep the value of silver and bronze coins balanced, even though metal prices often changed. It is surprising that Rome didn't use coins until around 350 BC, even though nearby Etruscan and Greek cities had been using them for over 100 to 200 years. This delay can't be explained by saying that foreign coins were enough, because very few have been found in early Roman areas. The real reason seems to be that after the Etruscan kings were removed, Rome became cut off from world trade and relied mainly on bartering, trading goods directly, and weighed copper for exchanges. It wasn't until a new, more democratic political group rose to power in 366 BC and showed interest in trade by founding the port city of Ostia, that Rome started making coins. These were made of bronze and were very large and heavy, weighing 1 pound or parts, multiples of a pound. For the next 80 years, during Rome's rapid growth in Italy, only bronze coins were used. But when Roman armies went south to fight in Campania, they met Greek and Oscan people who used silver money. To buy supplies and pay soldiers in this region, Rome needed silver coins. So silver coins were made in Campania, but it's unclear exactly how. The coins were marked Romano, but they were made in Capua, not Rome. One theory says that Capua, possibly under Rome's control, made the coins on Rome's behalf. Another idea is that Capua was still independent, but agreed to make coins for Rome's use in southern Italy, like it later did for other towns. These silver coins were called didrachms, each weighing about 7.58 grams. A single drachm was 1/72 of the Oscan pound. We don't know exactly how they were exchanged with Rome's bronze coins, but if the usual rate of 1 silver to 120 bronze was used, it would have been complicated. 1 didrachm would equal about 3 1/3 bronze asses. It's possible bronze was worth a little more at the time, and 3 asses were enough for 1 silver coin. It's not clear why Rome didn't start using these silver coins in the city itself during the 4th century. Very few of them have been found in Latium, the region around Rome, although Capuan bronze coins were common. Perhaps Rome, after having problems with copper money earlier, chose not to bring silver coins into use at home yet. This would make sense, considering Roman lawmakers of that time had little experience in financial matters and even banned charging interest. Around 312 BC, the size of the silver didrachm was reduced to about 6.82 grams, a move likely made by Rome. This probably upset the Campanians who used those coins. Rome could only have done this if it had strong control over Capua at the time. It's likely Capua had lost some of its power after acting against the Roman alliance. By reducing the weight of silver coins, Rome may have wanted to match their value more easily with the bronze as, at a rate of 1 silver to 120 bronze. This change gives a good example of Gresham's law, which says that lower quality money tends to replace higher quality money. During the long Samnite Wars, Rome began trading directly with Lucania and Apulia, where Greek silver coins were usually used. Rome's lighter didrachm, about 15% smaller than the common Tarentine coin, started pushing those coins out of use. In response, Tarentum reduced the weight of its own coins. This shows how powerful Rome was becoming in southern Italy. Around 300 BC, the bronze As, which was still the main coin in Rome, started to get lighter and eventually weighed about half a pound. Smaller coins were also reduced in the same way. The historian Mommsen thought this change was meant to turn bronze into token money. But there are problems with this idea. Bronze was still the main coin used in Rome's markets, and there isn't much proof that silver had become more common than bronze. Also, the Roman Republic was usually against the idea of money without real metal value. Rome tried hard to keep both bronze and silver coins at equal value. Lastly, the bronze as was not easy to fake, but if it had been worth much less than its metal content, people would likely have started making fake coins. Back then, the As was still valuable. It could buy a tenth of a sheep, or was worth about 1/3 of a silver double drachm. A better explanation is that the value of bronze went up a lot across the Mediterranean after Alexander the Great brought huge amounts of silver and gold from the east, which increased prices. Records from temples on the island of Delos show that prices of most goods doubled in the 50 years after Alexander's conquests. While we don't have exact records for copper prices, it's very likely that copper also became more expensive. So the Romans made the As smaller because bronze became more costly. But even this smaller half-pound As didn't last long. In the first 30 years of the 3rd century BC, coins kept getting smaller until the As weighed only 2 ounces, a sixth of a pound. Again, this change wasn't because Rome was switching to using only silver. It's more likely that copper prices had tripled. That might seem extreme, but even in modern times, we've seen prices rise sharply under similar pressures. At the time, the Roman army needed a lot of metal for wagons, ships, weapons, armor, and tools, especially during the long Samnite Wars. A big problem came in 296 BC, when the Samnites joined forces with the Gauls and Etruscans. Northern Etruria, which had been Rome's main source of copper, was now cut off. Although Rome pushed these enemies back, they lost access to copper again between 285 and 280 BC, even as their metal needs were growing. So, a threefold increase in the price of bronze isn't surprising. Roman writer Pliny later noted that in 280 BC, when Rome captured the Etruscan city of Volsini, they took 2,000 bronze statues as loot. A Greek writer joked that Rome went to war for art. But in truth, these statues were probably melted down for their metal. Rome had been short on bronze for years. By 269 BC, after years of war and economic chaos, Rome reformed its coin system. Peace had returned, and they had gained large amounts of metal from cities like Volsini and Volci. Prices of goods were now going back to normal, and Rome was ready for a better currency system. They replaced the old coins with a new system called the denarius system. It used the Attic pound, about 327 grams, instead of the lighter Oscan pound. The bronzes now weighed 2 ounces, and because the exchange rate between bronze and silver had stabilized at 1 to 120 again, the new as was worth only 1/6 of the old wartime ace. Rome also introduced a new silver coin, the denarius, worth 10 asses. It weighed about 4.55 grams, close in size to the Athenian drachm. Rome took a risk using this larger silver coin because it could be undercut by cheaper Greek silver coins. But Rome may have hoped her stronger economy and political power would help her compete, or even force southern mints to shut down. Over time, the silver mints in the south did close, probably because they couldn't compete. To match the denarius, a smaller silver coin was also made, the sestertius, worth 2.5 asses. Smaller bronze coins were also introduced to support everyday trade. It's surprising that some later Roman writers misunderstood a major monetary reform. They lived during a time when emperors were weakening the value of money by mixing in cheaper metals. These writers thought that reducing the weight of the bronze as to 2 ounces was a way to cheat people. One of them, Pliny, even said, "This allowed a profit of 5/6, and debts were cancelled by that much." But this is clearly wrong. In fact, the Roman government was honest in this reform. Both bronze and silver coins were issued at their true metal value. If anything, Rome actually lost money by choosing a denarius that was heavier than most similar coins. Also, debts were usually counted in silver, so people had to calculate repayment using the real metal value, not just the names of the coins. The term as simply meant a unit, and Roman courts respected property rights enough to not let people cheat just by changing the name of a coin. People who owed money in the old system could easily pay using the new system, just like how old British contracts in pounds were later paid in dollars after the American Revolution. Many historians who had seen bad money practices under the Roman Empire assumed that every change in republican coinage was dishonest. But during the Republic, unlike the Empire, the government didn't try to make profit by secretly lowering the value of coins, unless under extreme pressure. Most Roman citizens wouldn't allow that anyway. Soldiers, workers, and suppliers who got paid in coins were the same people who voted in the assemblies. They wouldn't support a plan that made their money worth less. In the Empire, things were different. The emperor paid government costs and could use cheap coins without asking anyone. Also, since the empire controlled most trade, it didn't matter if other countries rejected the coins. It was like in medieval England, where the silver pound lost most of its value because trade stayed within the country. But once foreign trade grew in Queen Elizabeth's time, the coins had to be honest again. So we should be careful when we hear claims that the Republic reduced coin value just to cheat. Most of those claims are actually about things that happened later. Only 1 or 2 possible cases from the early Republic might have involved dishonesty, and they were stopped quickly because people protested. One of Rome's most interesting financial decisions came in 217 BC, during the crisis of the Second Punic War. At that time, Rome reduced the as to just 1 ounce. The silver denarius, which had been worth 10 asses, was now made equal to 16. Also, new gold coins were issued worth 20, 40, and 60 sesterces. Pliny explained this by saying, "When Hannibal was threatening Rome during the dictatorship of Fabius Maximus, they changed the value of coins so the state made a profit, but soldiers were still paid 1 denarius for 10 asses. This seems like a dishonest move, but it's unlikely that Fabius Maximus, a conservative aristocrat, would approve a trick like that." Another writer, Festus, said the reform came from Flaminius, a democratic leader, which suggests the change was meant to help poor people in debt. Clearly, even ancient historians didn't agree on what really happened. Let's look at what was going on. In 217 BC, Rome had just suffered huge losses to Hannibal. The city needed to quickly raise new armies, build defenses, and prepare fleets. That meant it needed a lot more money in circulation. But bronze coins were disappearing. People were hiding them, and the enemy controlled Etruria, where Rome got its copper. It's unlikely that the reform was meant to cancel private debts. The state didn't have big debts at the time, and it even increased soldiers' pay to make up for the new coin values. Rome also had to sign many contracts for military supplies, which would still be paid at full market prices. So the real goal was probably to create more currency and keep the economy moving during wartime. The change also helped Rome by reflecting the rising value of bronze. 1 ounce of bronze was now worth about 1/16 of a silver denarius. So the denarius was now said to equal 16 asses instead of 10. There was no trick here. Both silver and bronze coins were meant to be used at their true value. The state also raised soldiers' pay to match the new system, and courts likely made sure contracts were settled fairly. The government gained several benefits. The silver denarius now matched the size of common Greek and Carthaginian coins, so it worked better in foreign trade. Rome took advantage of rising bronze prices to save money. The smaller new coins encouraged people to bring their hidden money back into use. The only downside was that the name denarius no longer matched its new value of 16 asses, which made calculations harder. Because of this, Roman business people began using the sestertius to keep track of accounts more easily. The gold coins made during this time were the first true Roman gold coins. The 1 scruple gold piece was marked as being worth 20 sesterces, and since the new silver sesterces weighed about 5/6 of a scruple, this means the exchange rate was roughly 1 gold to 16 silver. This was a high rate, especially compared to Greece, where gold usually exchanged at 1 to 12. But considering that gold was rare in Italy, and the goal was to create more currency during a time of crisis, the rate was actually reasonable. It's unfortunate that Rome had to move away from its earlier decimal-based system, but in a time of war, and without modern credit systems, the government had few better options. They needed more money in circulation, and they still managed to keep all 3 metals at fair market values, even though copper had become more expensive because of the war. This new system, created in 217 BC, stayed in place even into the Roman Empire. However, gold coins were soon removed from circulation, and bronze asses were not always produced. Later, during the Social War, the as was made even lighter, just half an ounce. But we don't know why, because copper's value at that time isn't well recorded. Rome's coin system wasn't perfect. Because the price of copper changed often, the size of the as also had to change frequently. This likely caused confusion in business. But gold was too rare to be used as the main coin, and relying on it could have led to worse problems. A system based only on silver might have worked better, but the Romans were very practical people and probably wouldn't have accepted bronze coins that had no real metal value until much later. Another problem was how the coins were introduced. The government decided when and how much money to mint, but they probably didn't have the best tools or data to make these decisions. This lack of planning likely caused many small economic crises, especially since banks and credit systems developed slowly. Still, Rome's system had a certain flexibility. Unlike some modern nations, they weren't dependent on how much gold they could dig out of the ground to decide how much money to create. Overall, the Roman Republic did a surprisingly good job. For 3 centuries, they managed to balance silver and bronze, adjust their money system to fit their growing empire, and keep their currency strong and respected. Later, under the emperors, things got worse. Coins lost almost all their value over time, and this ruined trust funds and public savings. Trying to compare Roman money directly to modern money is very difficult. Still, if we try to look only at statistics, we can see that gold in Cicero's time could buy more of the basic things poor people needed than it could in 1910. For example, it could buy twice as much wheat, rye, and cheese, 3 to 5 times more common vegetables, 6 times more dried beans, wine and olive oil at about 1/3 of the 1,910 price shoes, and coarse wool at 1/4 the price gold bought less silver than before, about 25% more copper, but only 20% as much iron, which was very expensive. Wealthy people could hire workers at about 1/10 of modern wages, but they also needed more servants. Meat like beef, pork, and chicken, which poor people couldn't afford, was about half as expensive as in 1910. Luxury items like fine wine, oil, and imported foods were not cheap. Rent prices, like today, varied by location. Cicero's house in a wealthy part of Rome cost 3.5 million sesterces, while young Sulla rented a modest apartment for just $150 a year. Poor workers could rent very basic rooms for about $1 per month. These examples help historians estimate that gold in Cicero's time had about 3 times the purchasing power it had in the 1900s. But this idea can be misleading. First, Rome didn't use gold as its main standard. If they had, gold would have become even more expensive. Also, what people bought and needed back then was different. Iron, for example, was not as important in ancient life and was very costly. Labor was more common, but also much cheaper. Prices were also more unstable in the ancient world. They changed depending on how far a product had to travel, and wars or famines caused sudden spikes. For example, the historian Polybius mentioned extremely low prices in places like Spain and Cisalpine Gaul. But these places were still very rural, traded little, and used coins rarely. So those prices don't reflect normal markets. It's also important to remember that slavery created a huge gap between rich and poor in Roman society. The everyday needs of a worker were completely different from those of a wealthy person. For example, bread could take up about half of a worker's income if he had a family to feed, but it likely made up less than 1% of Cicero's yearly spending. This difference makes it very hard to compare the value of money between ancient times and today. A laborer's silver coin might have bought 2 or 3 times more basic goods than in 1910, but only if he stuck to the cheapest items needed to survive. If he tried to live like a modern person, buying a variety of food, clothes, and comforts, prices would rise quickly, and he'd find those things just as expensive as today. As for wealthy people, it's not true to say their gold bought 2 or 3 times more than today. In fact, many of the things they needed were very expensive. Because transportation was slow and there were no machines, rich Romans had to spend a lot on services and items that are now cheap or automatic. Cicero, for example, had many costly needs. He traveled in private carriages, boats, or was carried by men. His mail was delivered by hired couriers. He had to pay for skilled scribes and assistants. Since there were no public safety services, he needed private staff. Rent in a good area of Rome was not cheap, even by modern standards. His furniture, silverware, and home decorations were likely just as expensive as today. Not because materials were expensive, but because everything was made by hand, which took time, even if the labor itself was cheap. Cicero once spent 100,000 sesterces, about $4,000, per year for his son's education in Athens. But this didn't bring him the kind of luxury $12,000 might bring today. Back then, there were no organized universities, so he had to pay private tutors. Travel, housing, books, which were handwritten, and servants added to the cost. These needs kept wealthy Romans from enjoying the same affordable items that the poor might buy. So, in the end, a pound of gold probably didn't give Cicero more value than it would today. It might have bought about the same. In 264 BC, Rome faced a major turning point and, true to its bold nature, chose a risky path. For the first time, Rome gained territory outside of Italy by going to war with Carthage over control of Sicily. What made this step truly important was not just the land itself, but the new political idea Rome unknowingly adopted there. In Sicily, Rome encountered a different model of rule, one where the ruling power collected taxes and tribute from its subjects. This was unlike the Roman system up to that point, where allies had kept some independence and didn't pay tribute. This system of control in Sicily came from Carthage and from local rulers like Hero of Syracuse, who had borrowed the idea from the kings of Egypt and Syria, who in turn had taken it from Alexander the Great and the old Persian Empire. Under this system, Carthage collected taxes like a tenth of the grain harvest and a fifth of other crops, and also rented out land for profit or farmed it for the state. It's unclear whether Rome went to war with Carthage just to take over these rich lands and their taxes, but some sources, like Polybius, say that Roman nationalists encouraged war by pointing out the financial benefits. Still, the Roman Senate was cautious, sending only small forces at first, mainly to protect the city of Messana and control access to the sea, not to conquer new territory. Those who expected quick profit from the war were very wrong. The war dragged on for 24 years and nearly bankrupted Rome. Men were constantly sent to fight, farms were abandoned, and the state fell deep into debt. To refill the army, Rome even gave citizenship to nearby peoples like the Sabines and Pisantines, extending Roman territory to the Adriatic Sea. In the end, Rome won and took over Sicily. They adopted many of the taxing systems Carthage had used, but didn't force people off the land or send settlers. That was likely because the war had cost so many lives that there weren't enough people to spare for colonies. Plus, it would take professional soldiers, not citizen settlers, to control a province where the people were now forced to pay taxes, whether they liked it or not. The tribute from Sicily included about 1 million bushels of wheat each year, enough to feed half the city of Rome. This grain was sold by the government in Rome. It's unclear how Roman farmers near the city felt about this new competition, but no serious protests are recorded. This may mean that central Italy was already starting to move away from growing wheat, focusing instead on grazing animals and farming olives and grapes. The flood of cheap Sicilian wheat only sped up this change. From this point forward, one province after another would be used mainly to feed Rome, and central Italy would never again be a major grain-producing region. In 232 BC, Flaminius, an early forerunner of the Gracchi brothers, pushed for a new use of public land. Instead of leasing it for profit as the Senate wanted, he argued it should be divided and given to citizens to help with social and economic problems. The land in question, called the Ager Gallicus, had been taken from the Senones in 285 BC, after they attacked Rome again. The land had mostly gone unused, probably rented in large chunks to wealthy cattle herders. Over time, as Rome grew, senators who could afford such investments found this very profitable. The Senate opposed Flaminius, not only to protect their own interests, but also because they believed the land should be used to bring steady income to the state. They worried that if the government gave land to citizens, people would expect the state to provide everyone with a living. This idea clashed with the Senate's view of Roman values. After the long war with Carthage, many small farmers had likely gone into debt or lost their land while serving in the army. This may have increased the pressure for land reforms. Flaminius faced strong opposition, but he eventually got his proposal passed in the People's Assembly. Later writers, especially those from the aristocracy, criticized Flaminius harshly. Polybius, echoing aristocratic views, even claimed this law was the start of Rome's decline and blamed it for future wars in northern Italy. Since most surviving histories were written by senators or their allies, Flaminius's career is often unfairly portrayed. Still, his law had a big effect. Instead of focusing on trade and profits from new provinces, Rome again turned inward to settle land and support its own citizens. The Second Punic War, fought mainly in Italy, caused massive damage to the country's main economic activity, farming. For over 12 years, battles moved back and forth across central and southern Italy. Cities surrendered to whichever army seemed stronger at the time, hoping for protection, but were often looted later by the other side. As armies moved, they destroyed grain fields, cut down vineyards and orchards, and took livestock with them. Many people fled. Some never returned, moving instead to places like Greece. In southern Italy, once thriving cities were left with only a few starving survivors huddled near the ruins. One interesting detail is the role of Marseille during the war. This suggests that economic reasons may have played a bigger role in starting the war than Roman historians like Livy admitted. Marseille had many trading posts along the Spanish coast and used to get goods from all over the peninsula. But when Carthaginian generals like Hamilcar and Hannibal started expanding their control, trade routes were cut and goods started moving toward Carthaginian ports instead. Carthage liked to control trade in its territories, so if it took over Spain, Marseille would be completely shut out. It's likely that Marseille tried to stop the Carthaginians on its own and then turned to Rome, warning them of Carthage's intentions and pushing them to act. The Ebro Treaty and Rome's alliance with Saguntum may have been the result of this pressure. After the war ended, Rome had to rebuild, but the state was weak and deep in debt. The few citizens willing to settle new lands were sent to dangerous border areas that needed protection. Cities like Cremona and Placentia were repopulated to defend against the Gauls. And a few ruined ports in the south also got small groups of settlers. But even these small numbers were hard to find, so some towns like Thurii and Vibo were re-established as Latin colonies, with non-Roman settlers included as well. Meanwhile, huge areas of farmland left abandoned during the war couldn't be settled right away. The state claimed ownership of these lands, partly because no one else did, and partly due to a new idea learned in Sicily, that conquered land belongs to the victor. This land, which may have covered 2 million acres, was about half usable for farming. Rome followed what seemed like a practical plan. It leased this land in large chunks to wealthy Romans who could afford to use it. This was better than letting the land sit unused, which would lead to crime and chaos. By law, public land could be rented in lots of 500 jugera per person, or 1,000 for citizens with 2 children. These were big pieces of land, so farming them intensively wasn't possible. There weren't enough workers, and transporting crops was hard. But the land could be used for cattle ranching, which needed fewer workers and was easier to profit from. Even with these offers, not all the land was rented. Officials, likely with the approval of local people, sometimes allowed ambitious renters to take more than their legal share. In some cases, they even allowed renters to let their animals graze on nearby public land that was officially still available. Over time, these extra lands became part of the renter's holdings, though not always legally. This kind of thing has happened in modern times too, in parts of the American West, for example. At first, people supported it because they saw it as progress. But later, when more settlers arrived and wanted land, opinions changed. The public began to demand protection of the land, and some officials were even punished for allowing what people had once supported. After the Second Punic War, when Rome slowly recovered and the population began to grow again, a process that took more than 1 generation, it became clear that the government had acted too quickly and carelessly with its land policies. Productive farmland had been taken over by large ranches. Instead of citizen soldiers raising families and preparing for future service, there were now slaves working the land, many brought from the east. Land that could have been used for Roman settlers was already occupied. Large-scale farming backed by wealthy landowners had become dominant, partly because the state had allowed it. By the time these large landholders had invested money and made improvements on the land, it was too late to easily take it back. If the Roman people, through their tribal assembly, pushed to return to the old idea of giving land to poor citizens, it might lead to serious unrest or even revolution. In fact, the problems that led to the Gracchi brothers' reforms and later conflicts can be traced back to this poor handling of land after the Punic War. To better understand Roman agriculture and daily life, we can look at how a typical mid-sized farm worked. Writers like Cato, Varro, and Columella give us a lot of useful information about farming practices. Virgil's Georgics and Pliny's Encyclopedia also help. Although each writer lived in a different time, the basic farming system stayed mostly the same, with only small changes to fit new needs. Farming in Italy was not like the massive, machine-driven wheat farms in modern Western countries. Even on large Roman estates, farming was done by hand. There were two main reasons. First, the soil in central Italy had already become poor and needed manure to stay productive, which took a lot of labor. Second, the land was rocky and uneven, not suited for big machines. Even today, farmers in the region still use simple wooden plows, like those described by Virgil. These light plows can't turn the soil deeply, so extra work is needed, like cross-plowing and breaking the ground with hand tools. That's why Roman farms needed many workers, not just for planting, but also for harvesting and threshing grain. So while big estates and small farms used similar tools and methods, the difference was in the social impact. Large estates replaced citizen farmers with teams of slaves. A typical Roman estate, or villa, was a large building with different sections. One area had storage for grain, tools, wine presses, and vats. Another section housed the slaves. The upper floor had rooms for the landowner, who might visit during breaks from his work in the city. These farms were usually 100 to 300 acres in size and were managed by a trusted slave and his wife. If the estate focused on grain farming, the owner might have needed 40 to 50 slaves. The goal was to make a good profit from one main crop, while also growing enough food to feed the slaves and provide for the villa's basic needs. A typical wheat farm in ancient Rome needed many slaves. In autumn, they began plowing, which was a slow job because oxen walked slowly and needed to rest often. Still, the Romans preferred oxen over horses, since oxen could later be eaten while horse meat was considered worthless. Cattle were useful not just for work, but also for milk, cheese, and meat. Even though oxen worked slowly, slave labor was cheap, so it didn't matter much. Because Roman plows were simple and not very effective, fields had to be plowed 2 or 3 times. If the field was newly cleared, slaves had to break up the grass with hand tools. They also had to dig drainage ditches about 12 feet apart to stop water from collecting and rotting the crops during winter rains. All this required a lot of hard manual work. In spring, when the sun began drying the soil, slaves weeded the fields and broke the ground between the plants to keep water from evaporating. At harvest time, they cut the grain heads first and later came back for the rest of the stalk. The straw was used for roofing slave huts, feeding animals, or making compost. Threshing was done by hand with flails, and winnowing followed. Since the slaves needed food and jobs, keeping them busy was important. Fertilizing the soil was also essential. The main reason for keeping animals was often just to collect their manure. One animal provided enough fertilizer for half an acre. There were no chemical fertilizers during the Republic, but in the Empire, Chalk and lime from Gaul were used. To cover the daily costs of running the farm and keep the slaves working between harvests, farmers often planted extra crops. Willow trees near swamps gave twigs for basket making on rainy days. Elm and poplar trees gave firewood, materials for pottery and lime kilns, and leaves for animal feed. Slaves also had small gardens for vegetables like cabbage and turnips. Pigs were raised if oak trees were nearby, since acorns were needed to fatten them up. Sheep grazed on rough land or between olive trees, and old slave women spun their wool into cloth. Some farmers raised chickens or even luxury birds like peacocks. One farmer made $25,000 a year selling fish and poultry, and another raised thousands of thrushes for profit. Still, landlords usually focused their land on what brought the most money. They didn't see their farms as homes, but as businesses. If it made more sense, they even sent food and clothing to the farm from the city, instead of growing or making it there. Wheat couldn't be planted on the same land year after year without wearing out the soil. So farmers used crop rotation. One year they'd grow wheat, the next year rye or barley, and every few years a soil-enriching crop like peas or beans. Sometimes these green crops were plowed back into the soil, or the land was left empty to rest while sheep grazed on it. By the 1st century AD, most of Western Italy wasn't used for growing wheat regularly. Even with cheap slave labor, importing grain by sea was cheaper. When Dionysius of Halicarnassus visited Rome during Augustus's time, he said the whole region looked like a garden. As a Greek used to rocky hills, what he really saw were lots of vineyards and orchards, figs, peaches, apples, plums, olives, and almonds. These farms sometimes grew grain or vegetables between the rows of trees. In Italy's sunny climate, this worked well. Light crops grew better with some shade. Trees like elms and poplars were planted about 40 feet apart and used to support grapevines. Fig trees provided both fruit and support for vines. Elm and poplar trees were ideal because they didn't block too much sun, and their leaves could be fed to animals. By mixing vines with vegetables and grains, farmers made the most of their land. This let them make money earlier, and if the grape crop failed, they still had other crops to depend on. Sheep farming was often done alongside olive growing, because sheep could graze on the grass that grew between the olive trees. Farmers also found that they could grow grains in the same olive groves. In places like Campania, where the land was fertile and there was enough water for irrigation, it was even possible to grow 3 different crops each year: grains, beans, and vegetables between the rows of grapevines. This was possible because the volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius made the soil rich, and rivers from the nearby mountains provided plenty of water to the flat land. However, other areas like Latium and Tuscany did not have these natural advantages. In general, Roman farmers were skilled at using manure, planting legumes that added nitrogen to the soil, and rotating crops to avoid exhausting the land. Over time, they also knew how to switch between different types of farming: grain growing, animal grazing, and fruit production, to let the soil recover when needed. Although, as we'll see later, farming in Italy eventually could not meet the food needs of Rome, it is unlikely that local farmers were the ones to blame for this failure. During the 5th century BC, as Rome's political power weakened, it was unlikely she could hold on to the trade and industry that had once flourished under the Etruscan kings. In fact, the number of people working in industry likely decreased during this time. The slow-moving political changes that ended with the plebeian victories in 339 BC did not resemble modern workers' revolts. This suggests there wasn't a large industrial working class in the city. Some people think that because the Servian Wall enclosed such a large area, the city must have had a big population, with many people working in trades. but the wall took a wide route, partly to use natural hills for defense and to include religious sites. We don't know how much empty land it enclosed, so we can't estimate the city's population just based on the wall. In the 4th century BC, some political actions suggested that the urban working class was gaining influence. Appius Claudius, a well-known politician, helped build an aqueduct for poor neighborhoods and supported a freedman named Flavius for public office. He also tried to allow poor citizens without property to register in any voting district, which would have given the city's poor more power in elections. His proposal was later rejected, but it shows that by this time, there were many people in Rome working outside of farming. However, when we look for evidence of products made by these workers, there isn't much. Greek writers don't mention buying Roman goods, and archaeologists have found very few Roman-made items outside Latium. The local pottery from this time is poor in quality, and better pottery was made in Campania and Etruria. There are a few exceptions, like 2 nice vases from Falerii with Latin writing, but even these might not have been made by Romans. A bronze box known as the Ficaronian Cista says it was made in Rome by an artist named Novios Plautios, but the design is clearly not Roman. These few examples suggest that while some craftsmen worked in Rome, their industries didn't last long or grow from local demand. Overall, the industrial workers in Rome probably just made basic goods, like clothes, tools, and pots needed for daily life and the military. The 4th century BC was not a time of industrial growth anywhere. After the Peloponnesian War, Greek cities were weak. Etruria also declined after losing Campania, Latium, and northern Italy. Even Alexander the Great's conquests didn't create long-term trade in the central Mediterranean, just a short burst of activity due to sudden wealth, not real economic growth. The financial records from Delos show how wages and production declined over time. In Rome, Appius Claudius's reforms didn't succeed, and nobody pushed for similar changes again soon after. With many men needed for military service and colonies, there was no pressure for social reforms. In the next 2 centuries, we don't see much change in how things were made in Rome. Basic goods likely became more common as the city grew, since shipping cheap items was too expensive. But we still don't hear of Roman exports. What did change was that more and more work was done by slaves instead of free citizens. This made manual work seem low status, and poor Roman citizens who couldn't get land would rather rely on state support than do slave-like labor. Slaves became the new workers in industry, but they had no voice in politics. So the voice of the working class in Rome went silent. For a long time, trade in Rome did not do much better than its industries. In the Western Mediterranean, cities like Marseille, Carthage, and some Greek colonies in Italy led most of the trade. Smaller cities like Caere and Antium, without strong governments, turned to piracy instead of proper trade. Roman trade didn't grow much because it lacked strong production to support it. Also, Rome's farming nobility looked down on business and often gave up trade rights in treaties for political gain. In a treaty made in 348 BC, Carthaginian traders were allowed to sell goods freely in Latium, but Roman merchants were not allowed into most Carthaginian lands. Worse, Roman ships weren't even allowed to sail along parts of Italy's coast. Around this time, Rome founded a small colony at the mouth of the Tiber River to help ships offload their cargo more easily. The current of the Tiber was strong, and most sailing ships couldn't make it upstream to Rome. The new harbor helped by letting goods be transferred to smaller boats or stored in warehouses. The colony was small, only about 6 acres, but it was enough for many years. It wasn't expanded until the time of the Gracchi brothers. During the war with Hannibal, Rome needed to transport supplies to armies in places like Spain, Sardinia, and Sicily. To get enough ships, the government offered insurance to shipping companies. However, some companies cheated the system by sinking old, useless ships just to collect money. After the war, Rome still needed ships for moving grain to armies in Greece and Asia, which gave Roman traders a chance to enter Eastern markets. But Greek and Syrian merchants already dominated that area. They spoke the languages, understood the customers, and were hard to compete with. So outside of government contracts, Roman merchants didn't succeed much. The government also didn't really support Roman trade unless it helped supply the military. Even before the Punic Wars, Roman law stopped senators from owning sea-going ships. This law might have been made to stop them from misusing public money on ports near their own land. Some say the law protected trade monopolies, but there is no real evidence of this. Livy, a Roman historian, believed that Romans simply thought trade was below the dignity of senators. Julius Caesar later renewed this law, showing that the idea remained popular. Another reason was that senators were needed in Rome to do public work and couldn't travel freely without permission. Looking at the 2nd century BC, people often say Roman business was powerful and helped push for wars like the destruction of Carthage and Corinth. But historical records show very little Roman trade during that time, and only during the Gracchian reforms do we see any effort to support merchants. Even after Hannibal was defeated, Rome let Carthage control much of the sea trade. When Carthage fell in 146 BC, Rome didn't even build its own harbor in the new province, instead letting the nearby city of Utica handle all the trade, including trade for Romans. In Sicily, Rome did not give special trade rights to its own merchants. Even in cities like Ambracia, where Rome asked for tax breaks in 189 BC, those breaks were extended to Rome's allies too, including Greek cities that were actually competitors in trade. When Rome helped Marseille secure new trade in Gaul in 135 BC, it still did not set up similar rules for its own merchants in Spain, Africa, or Asia. Later, when Rome gave the island of Delos to Athens, it made the port tax-free for everyone. Rome did this mostly so its armies in the east could get supplies easily, but it was Greek, Syrian, and Egyptian merchants who profited, not the Romans. Delian records from the 2nd century show that most of the merchants came from those regions. A few Western names appear, but they usually belonged to southern Italian Greeks or Campanian traders, not native Romans. Roman merchants only became more common after Rome took control of the province of Asia. Even then, Roman trade was not strong. The city of Rome didn't even invest in fixing its main port, Ostia, during the Republic. Large ships had to dock at Puteoli, over 150 miles away. It wasn't until the time of Emperor Claudius that Ostia's harbor was properly improved. All in all, the Roman Republic showed very little interest in supporting or growing its own trade. No other major state in ancient history was so careless about commerce. In the earlier parts of this book, we often saw that Rome's habit of taking over new lands pulled people and money away from business and industry. This shift toward land ownership was a big reason why Rome had such limited economic interests. It's useful to look at how this choice affected Roman society, especially how it created certain moral beliefs and social groups that helped people feel that Rome's economic system was natural or justified. This also helps explain why modern ideas about economics and society don't always work well when applied to Roman history. In today's world, public opinion can quickly reach the government through elections and fast communication. But in the Roman Republic, even strong needs or demands from certain groups often didn't lead to new laws or government actions. For example, laborers today can influence laws about money, jobs, or trade. But in Cicero's time, they had very little power. Most workers were either slaves, who had no say at all, or free clients who followed the orders of their wealthy patrons. Even if a free man wanted to vote independently, he would usually be grouped in one of the 4 urban tribes, mostly made up of former slaves and their children. He couldn't form unions or demand better pay because his wages and living conditions were based on what slaves earned. In all of Rome's long history, there is no record of a labor strike. Poor people got only what the ruling class allowed them to have, and usually that was just charity. So while workers had many needs, they had no real way to push the government to meet them. When we look at employers instead of workers, we also see big differences from today. In modern countries, business people often run both the economy and the government. But in ancient Rome, business was not respected. Even Cicero, who wanted harmony between social classes, had to argue whether businessmen were truly respectable people. He decided they were. But he also said that any man who traveled to the provinces to make money was not a true Roman. Real citizens, in his view, should not leave the center of Roman life just to make a profit. If wealth had truly brought respect and political power in Rome, then rich business people would have made it into the Senate. But they were kept out until Julius Caesar's time. Rarely did a new man become consul. And if he did, it was usually because he was a good speaker or a successful general, not because he was rich. Rome's government didn't see the value of strong industry or trade. It didn't create helpful policies like trade tariffs or business subsidies. There was no lobby of merchants or manufacturers in the Senate. Economic struggles happened, but they weren't usually handled through politics. Instead, social class divisions kept business interests out of power. Wealthy men did gain some recognition when the government needed them. The Roman Republic didn't have permanent government departments for collecting taxes or building infrastructure, so it relied on wealthy capitalists to handle those contracts. In return, they got minor honors like a title, a gold ring, or good theater seats. This class, called the Equites, became a political force in the last 100 years of the Republic. But they earned their place not through business success alone, but through helping the government with practical needs. Even then, their status was clearly below that of the noble ruling class. On the other hand, farmers were very influential through most of the Republic. Landowners controlled most of the rural tribes, and their interests often matched those of the senators, who also owned large farms. Oddly, though, we don't see many laws passed to protect Roman crops. Still, the dominance of landowners probably explains why the government ignored the needs of trade and industry, created a poor tax system, and avoided complex economic reforms. It was hard for farmers to act together as a single group. Because of poor transportation, each farmer cared most about his local market. This made them split into different factions based on their needs. That might explain why we see so few laws that clearly favored farmers. Their influence showed more in things like wanting safer borders and peace with neighboring tribes. A successful farmer in the countryside had everything to lose from constant raids, so he supported peace and protected property rights. Eventually, these farmers organized military forces to fight back against raiders, demanded payment for damages, and even used fear as a weapon. So economics played a big role in forming the Latin League, but this didn't mean that Rome used economics to drive its policies directly. Rome's ruling class, the nobility, usually had the power to turn their goals into action. Their economic interests were often similar, so these were rarely ignored. However, as we've seen, they paid little attention to the needs of business, trade, or the working class. That said, we shouldn't assume that the nobles only cared about money. A typical Roman noble was practical and realistic, not overly emotional, and usually fair. Of course, money still mattered to him. He had to protect his wealth and meet the financial standards expected of his social class. This meant managing his land carefully and receiving gifts or inheritances from clients. Still, the motives of a senator were complex. While modern thinking often says people use political power to increase their wealth, this doesn't fully apply to Roman senators. They weren't businessmen and didn't spend much time managing their personal finances. Instead, their days were filled with state affairs, court duties, and legal matters. And because senators held their positions for life, they didn't need to win votes by serving the material needs of ordinary citizens. It's also helpful to consider the social environment of a Roman senator. From childhood, he was surrounded by statues of his ancestors, many of whom had been war heroes, lawmakers, or governors. These ancestors were remembered with great respect. None of them were business leaders. Their achievements in politics, war, and public life were held up as the highest form of success. A noble boy who passed by these statues every day would naturally grow up wanting gloria, fame, and honor. The Romans believed true virtue needed no reward except praise and glory. This idea remained strong even during later times of civil war and political corruption. Romans deeply respected the bravery of their ancestors. The noble class even wrote most of Roman history, preserving their own values. This admiration showed up in ceremonies like public speeches, military triumphs, honorary statues, and special burials for heroes. To really feel the spirit of these men, one can read Virgil's stories of Roman heroes or Livy's history of Rome. Their sense of discipline, strength, and pride came from generations of struggle. In the early noble families, these values were passed down like a bloodline. Only when civil wars broke the old order and immigration and wealth diluted the traditional Roman character did these values begin to fade. As mentioned earlier, senators were so focused on political and diplomatic duties that they often ignored economic issues. They had to deal with complex relationships, treaties with many different types of states, from allies to enemies, decisions about provinces, the appointment of governors, and military planning. These matters involved legal details, social rank, and formal honors. As a result, senators became more like legal experts or administrators, not business-minded leaders. That's a big reason why the Senate rarely focused on economic development. The Senate also worked hard to protect its own power and status, auctoritas senatus. This was both about personal pride and the money and benefits that came with office. For example, if a consul proposed a new war to expand Roman land, the Senate might block it. The nobles had learned early that when a small city like Rome grew too fast, it needed a big army to control its empire, and popular military leaders could become threats to the Senate's power. So, in general, economic demands in Rome were often blocked by other forces. Workers had no way to make their voices heard. Business had little influence. Farmers were spread out and didn't unite. And the noble class was too focused on politics and their own status to pay much attention to economics. But Roman economic life was also much simpler than it is today. As Rome slowly conquered more land, it absorbed extra people and money, so there wasn't an urgent need for industry or trade. Simple investments in land or large-scale farming were enough to keep people comfortable, though eventually it made them lazy and dependent. Rome never faced the kind of complex economic problems that modern governments do. So it's unfair to say that writers like Livy and Tacitus ignored economics because they didn't understand it. They focused on politics because that was the heart of Roman society, and they understood that very well. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, Rome was full of unrest. The pro-Greek upper class had led the country into many alliances across Greece and the East. These alliances now forced Rome to choose, either continue being insulted as a friend or take full control. Rome chose control, although many leaders were unsure about it. The Senate feared the strong army needed for empire, and the popular leaders worried that the Senate would gain more power through ruling the provinces. Foreign affairs had become so deeply connected to domestic politics that even the simplest reforms could not be debated without conflict. Political tensions were dividing the city. Rome's population was also changing, not because of immigration, but because many freed slaves and war captives were now part of society. Aemilianus exaggerated when he said the people who supported Gracchus' reforms were the same ones he had once brought to Rome in chains. But there was some truth in it. The chance for peaceful reform had faded. Now, political change came through violence. This was mostly because real Italians were being replaced by people from the East, North Africa, and Spain. Another big problem was the land leasing system. Those leasing public lands had taken most of the free land, which made it hard to give any to new generations. Worse, since these large leaseholders had more resources than small farmers, they were able to take over even private small plots. As a result, for 60 years before the Gracchus reforms, Rome's citizen population didn't grow, possibly because many peasants gave up and either moved away or became part of the poor crowds in the cities. Tiberius Gracchus, a young nobleman, tried to fix this. He was close to a group of moderate thinkers who read Stoic philosophy. During a trip through Etruria, he noticed that large farms depended on slave labor, which he believed was morally wrong. In his campaign speeches, he said such a system couldn't support the army with strong citizen soldiers. He also appealed to ideals of fairness. He believed that the state owed every loyal citizen a piece of land to live on. His plan was to take back public land that was being held in violation of the old Licinian law and give it to Roman citizens in small plots as low-rent leases that could not be sold. The Senate rejected the idea. They argued it was unfair to take land back that the state had ignored for generations, especially land that had been improved or sold legally. They also warned Italians who had settled that land that they would likely lose it to Roman citizens. Blocked by the Senate, Tiberius turned to an old constitutional rule from 287 BC that allowed a law to be put to a public vote in the plebeian assembly. But another tribune, Octavius, used his legal right to block the vote. In response, Tiberius introduced a new law that allowed voters to remove tribunes who acted against the wishes of the people. This passed, though it caused major controversy, and was seen by many as nearly rebellious. It set a dangerous precedent and was rarely used again. But Tiberius had a point. Tribunes were meant to serve the people, not the government, and having 10 of them often led to deadlock. By allowing a recall, he hoped to fix this. So, with these changes, Tiberius pushed through his land reform. He created a committee to examine land claims and hand out the land. The Senate kept trying to block it, and after Tiberius died, they canceled the committee's power. Still, some of the boundary markers they set up have been found. Historian Mommsen believed that a jump of 73,000 names on the census of 125 BC likely meant that many new people had received land. If so, the reform was a big success. One funny detail remains. A milestone was found that was set up by Popilius, Tiberius's main opponent, saying, "I was the first to make the landowners give land back to the farmers." It might have been a joke by someone carving the stone, or maybe Popilius was clever enough to take credit once the reform became popular. Tiberius Gracchus tried to get re-elected, but this caused a riot in which he was killed, and his reforms came to a stop. His brother, Gaius Gracchus, later became tribune in 124 BC and continued the reform movement, expanding it even further. He brought back his brother's land reform, gave cheap grain to the poor, and let tax collection in the province of Asia be handled by wealthy Roman businessmen. One law took away the Senate's control over judicial committees, and another law said that only knights, not senators, could serve as jurors. He also proposed new colonies and wanted to give Roman citizenship to Latin allies and eventually to all Italians. Gaius Gracchus remains a mysterious figure because all the records we have were written by people who either strongly supported or hated him. From the parts of his speeches that survive, we can see that he sometimes acted like a political leader trying to gain support. He may have passed some laws mainly to build alliances. Some of his actions were even personal attacks on enemies. But that doesn't mean his overall plan was bad. In ancient Rome, revenge, especially for a murdered brother, was seen as honorable and even expected. Some accused him of using free grain as a bribe to gain support. That could be true, but it's also possible that Gaius planned this only as a temporary solution, until he could move poor people out to new colonies. In the meantime, the cheap grain helped feed workers he employed in public projects. It might also have been an early example of state-supported welfare, possibly inspired by his Stoic teacher, Blossius. At that time, the idea that a state should help its poor was becoming popular in Greece. And since Rome's warehouses were full of Sicilian grain, Gaius may have felt it was right to let the people use it. Unfortunately, the policy led to long-term problems. It weakened the success of his colonization plans, and later leaders were too afraid to stop the free grain, which caused more poverty over time. But it's common for the first social reformers to make mistakes. Even today, countries under pressure sometimes act quickly to keep their people fed and happy, even if it causes trouble later. Two of his most debated reforms were moving jury duties from senators to knights and letting Roman businessmen collect taxes in Asia. Critics said this created conflict between the Senate and the knights, and later it allowed tax collectors too much power over provincial governors. But at the time, Gaius probably didn't foresee those outcomes. He seemed more focused on giving power and responsibility to the business class, which he trusted. Even if the knights didn't perform better than senators as jurors, they likely did no worse. The new tax system in Asia brought in more money and was more reliable than relying on local officials who were often unfriendly to Rome. Yes, the tax companies could be corrupt, but under the Roman Republic, with short one-year terms for officials, there was no permanent civil service to manage taxes. Gaius saw contracts as a way to make things more efficient. He knew some areas were bad at managing money, and others simply avoided paying taxes. Even if he was aware that tax collectors sometimes cheated people, he trusted that Roman governors or tribunes would punish the worst abuses. In the end, these actions show that Gaius Gracchus believed in working with the wealthy. Like Appius Claudius and Flaminius before him, he saw value in giving rich citizens a role in public service, a rare attitude among Roman leaders of the time. Gaius Gracchus also supported the merchant class by creating a new kind of colony, colonies at important seaports. These were not just for defense anymore, but to support and grow trade across the Mediterranean. After the destruction of Carthage's port in 146 BC, the Senate failed to replace it with a Roman-controlled trade hub. As a result, the African province had to rely on non-Roman ports like Utica. Gracchus aimed to fix this by founding a Roman colony at Carthage. He also planned another colony at Tarentum, which had been damaged during the Punic Wars. This would help revive the area, especially since much of the newly given land was located in southern Italy. A third colony was built at Latium near Vibo, likely because merchants wanted a shortcut to avoid the risky sail around the Straits of Messina. At that time, Rome was still transporting goods by land all the way from Puteoli. These actions suggest that Gracchus was working closely with experienced business leaders during his reforms. The reform that led to Gracchus's downfall was a proposal to give Roman citizenship to all people who already had Latin rights, and to extend Latin rights to the rest of the Italian allies. This reform didn't offer direct benefits to Roman voters, so it didn't win popular support. His enemies accused him of trying to create a new group of voters loyal only to him, although it's hard to see why he would risk his current power just for that. Gracchus likely wanted to make sure the Italians had fair access to land reform and legal protection from abuse by Roman officials. He also wanted to strengthen the citizen army and limit the power of freedmen in the city. Although the reform failed, it gave hope to the Italians and helped spark the social war. Unfortunately, the Gracchian reforms didn't fix Rome's deeper problems. Most of the major reforms were blocked by the Senate or changed so much in practice that they lost their original value. Even successful reforms had unintended consequences. The land reforms improved parts of central Italy and helped Rome for a while, but since they weren't fully carried out, they helped lead to the social war. The grain handouts made things worse over time by encouraging dependency. Recognizing the knights in politics could have improved Rome's economic policy, but since the Senate fought them at every step, they became a selfish group focused only on profit from government contracts. The revival of popular voting power only made sense if the voting population was expanded as the Gracchi wanted. Without that change, the Roman people were not able to govern themselves well, let alone rule an empire. Once the people regained control of the political system, the damage to the constitution led straight to civil wars and eventually the rise of Caesar and one-man rule. From an economic point of view, several changes are important. The rise of the merchant and business class as a political power, the end of land colonization in Italy, and the acceptance of permanent state charity for Rome's poor. This last decision discouraged work in the city and hurt industry for a long time. During the time of the Gracchi, Rome took control of a new and unusual province in Asia and opened up the African province for settlement in a new way. These changes soon allowed private business interests to get involved in politics and even influence Rome's decisions about expanding its territory. The last king of the Attalid dynasty had left his kingdom to Rome in his will. This made sense, since most of his territory had been given to his ancestor Eumenes II by Rome after being taken from the Seleucids. The new Roman province was around 60,000 square miles and made up of a mix of cultures and systems that no Roman governor could fully understand. Generally, the area could be divided into two types: free Greek cities along the coasts and rivers, and many small rural estates worked by semi-free native villagers. Under the old kings, these villagers lived on land technically owned by the crown. They paid about 1/10 of their crops in tax, and also gave part of their harvest and labor to their local lords. These lords had received their land either by buying it or as rewards for military or court service. Although they held the land by the king's permission, their rights were usually inherited and passed on to others. This created a complex feudal system across the inland countryside, inherited from earlier empires like the Seleucids, Alexander's empire, and the Persians. An inscription from before Rome's arrival gives insight into how this system worked. It records a mortgage deal in which a nobleman named Minnesimachus borrowed about $6,000 using his estate as collateral. The land included 5 villages whose people were part serfs of the king, and other plots paying tribute. From this, we see that lords earned money from rents, labor from peasants, and perhaps profits from small local businesses. Other records show this was a common setup in the non-Greek areas of the kingdom. In contrast, many of the Greek cities had been tax-free since Alexander's time. Some had started paying taxes later in return for royal protection. These cities often controlled nearby villages that paid tribute to them, just as other villages had paid taxes to the king. There were also large temples that owned land and had workers, including semi-free farmers and temple slaves. Some temples didn't pay taxes, while others did depending on how they got their land. Additionally, the king had royal farms, parks, gardens, mines, and factories that produced rugs, parchment, and other goods. So what would the Roman Republic do with such a complicated inheritance? Would it keep the feudal system, recognize the different city and temple rights, and even continue running royal factories? Sadly, we have little clear evidence. Roman political groups argued about what to do, and instead of focusing on good governance, they became more interested in profiting from Asia. Tiberius Gracchus had planned to sell off the king's movable property to fund his reforms, but he was killed before he could make it happen. The Senate stepped in and sent 5 senators to Asia to figure out how to govern the province. When they arrived, they found that an illegitimate son of Eumenes had started a rebellion, gaining support from local peasants by promising them land and freedom. After he was defeated, another senator, Aquilius, was sent to organize the province. Aquilius's commission gave freedom and tax immunity to the Greek cities, as the king had wished. It seems that temple lands were also exempt from taxes. There's no sign that Rome changed the setup of the rural lands where peasants paid dues. Much of that land stayed in the hands of rich landlords. While forced labor may have ended, Rome likely didn't change local customs too quickly. Taxes were still collected and sent to Rome, probably by a financial officer working under the governor. The king's personal property was taken by Rome. His farms became public land. Factories and mines were likely shut down, and the workers were sent to Rome. The Senate wasn't interested in running businesses. The Senate also decided the province was too big, so it gave Phrygia to the king of Pontus and let some mountainous areas govern themselves. Rome didn't want the burden of maintaining armies in difficult places. The goal was simple: let the province support itself and give Rome a stronger position in Asian affairs. Nothing more. Gaius Gracchus was more bold and active than cautious. When he became tribune, he spent large amounts of public money on building roads, improving streets, constructing ports, and storing grain. But then he noticed that the tax income, called the stipend, from the province of Asia was much lower than expected. This tax was collected gently by the governor's financial officer, the quaestor, but it didn't bring in enough. As a supporter of democracy, Gaius couldn't understand why the wealthy Greek cities in Asia, which had been taken from King Antiochus years before, didn't have to pay tax, while the rural peasants still did. He also didn't agree with giving up Phrygia. Since Roman businessmen had shown they were good at managing contracts, Gaius decided to let them collect taxes in Asia. This would provide money quickly, please the knights, and take responsibility away from the provincial governor. It would also allow taxes to be collected in crops, which would be easier for poor farmers during bad harvests. The People's Assembly agreed to this, and the Senate's earlier settlement of Asia was changed. The Greek cities now had to pay taxes on their land, even though their land was small. Phrygia was also added back into the province. Today, many scholars believe that Rome considered these large rural areas in Asia, once ruled by the kings of Pergamum, as Roman public land. But this is doubtful. That legal idea probably only developed later, during Julius Caesar's or Augustus' time, when Roman lawyers created the concept of dominium in solo provinciali. There's no proof that such a view was used in Asia during the Republic. Yes, after Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, its land became ager publicus, but that was war booty. Even when Caesar conquered Gaul, there's no sign that Rome took ownership of all the land. So it's more likely that Rome just continued to collect the same taxes that the kings of Pergamum had collected before, without thinking too much about the theory of royal land ownership. Only the personal property and private lands of the king were taken as public land. Still, although these crown lands were mostly safe from political exploitation, the system of tax contracts created many problems between the Senate and the knights. Even though Gaius originally wanted Phrygia to remain a tax-free protectorate, the knights eventually moved in and began taxing it anyway. They also caused trouble by checking the financial records of the Greek cities and temple estates, looking for hidden sources of income. Records show that Roman officials had to step in several times to protect locals, but the knights kept expanding their power. If local people couldn't pay taxes, the knights would loan them money at high interest, then seize their land when they couldn't repay. When local governors tried to protect the people, the knights, who now controlled the law courts in Rome, could bring false charges against them. That said, not all proprietors were innocent. Some started placing Roman soldiers in the cities and forced the cities to pay for them. If these governors could save some of the money budgeted for the army, they might return it to the state or keep it for themselves. In some cases, governors and their financial officers even worked together to keep the extra money. As a result, ruling Asia became a way to get rich, and arguments between the Senate and the knights over who controlled the courts became more intense. Finally, while Rome was distracted by the social war in 89 to 88 BCE, Mithridates, the ambitious king of Pontus, saw an opportunity and invaded the province of Asia, looting and taking control. Mithridates and his supporters killed around 80,000 Italians living in the province of Asia. Many of these people worked as tax collectors, assistants, or laborers helping the tax companies store and sell grain and fruit from local farms. According to a note by Posidonius, many of the victims had only recently become Roman citizens after the social war. Most were likely Greek or Oscan Italians who had lived and worked in the East for years, as they knew the local languages and trade customs. Some of them may have left Italy during the social war to avoid fighting, and ended up working in Asia. It's unclear how many Roman citizens had moved to Asia by then, but probably not many. This mass killing, which Greek cities were forced by Mithridates to take part in, started a long period of trouble for both Roman businessmen and the province of Asia. Things got worse when, 4 years later, Sulla demanded that the province pay all the back taxes from the past 5 years at once, along with a massive war fine totaling 20,000 talents. He didn't use the usual Roman tax collectors, but divided the province into districts, making each responsible for collecting its share of the money. Cities had to find the funds by any means, often borrowing money or mortgaging public buildings and lands. Temples, which ran their own banks, likely gave loans as long as they had the money. Roman businessmen and knights also became deeply involved in giving out loans in Asia. Many village farmers, who had little cash, couldn't pay. So landlords had to cover the taxes for them. Many borrowed from Roman lenders, often at very high interest rates, sometimes up to 48%. Debts grew quickly, and Roman loan agents kept offering new loans as older payments came due. Over 14 years, the debt increased from 20,000 to 120,000 talents. Every time Mithridates made a move, Roman bankers panicked, especially when he invaded Bithynia in 74 BCE. To handle the crisis, the Senate sent Lucullus, one of its trusted members, to lead the war, even though his official area was Cilicia. After defeating Mithridates, Lucullus tried to help the suffering province. He passed a law to limit interest rates to 12% and canceled any extra interest beyond the original loan amount. Since many of the debts were 15 years old, this reduced the effective rate to about 6%. He also created a new tax plan, including taxes on slaves and houses, but capped the yearly payment at 1/4 of the harvest. His plan would allow debts to be cleared within 4 years. Still, many had already lost their land before this help came. Cicero's letters later show that many Romans had taken over land in Asia. Likely, cities gave up land in desperation, and landlords who couldn't afford to pay for their tenants handed over their estates to Roman creditors. These lands still had to pay tax, but wealthy Roman owners were harder for tax collectors to exploit than locals. This created a group of Roman landowners who began to oppose the public tax agents. Now about Africa. The Roman province there started after Carthage fell in 146 BCE. At first, it was small. Some Phoenician cities remained independent and even gained extra land. The province only covered a square area about 50 miles wide near Carthage, just a small piece of what is now Tunisia. Even within that, the city of Utica kept its own land and freedom. Rome tried to sell the land to raise money, but few people were interested. Local Berber farmers and shepherds still lived in the hills, and Rome let them stay. They were made to pay a tax like before. In 122 BCE, since a lot of good farmland was still unused, Gaius Gracchus sent about 6,000 settlers there, each receiving a large plot of 130 acres. This was much more than the usual 20 to 30 acres given in Italy, showing that Africa wasn't a popular destination. These settlers now owned private, tax-free land. After Gracchus died, the Senate canceled his colony but let the settlers keep their land. Later, some less valuable land remained, especially in the hills. In 115 BCE, Roman censors decided to rent this land out for 5 years at whatever price they could get. Romans, Latins, or locals could bid for it, and the province's quaestor handled the payments, which went to tax contractors. The agrarian law of 111 BCE confirmed these arrangements and sent officials to Africa to sort out land ownership and disputes. The law listed 4 main types of land: land sold after the war, land left with tax-paying locals, land given by Gracchus, and land rented out in 5-year contracts. The law also said rent on these lands couldn't be raised, so renters could stay long-term if they paid. The Senate likely wanted to stop managing land and create a stable system. The third group, Gracchian colonists, was the most important because they owned large and fertile farms. These men had become quite wealthy landowners. In Italy, a typical farmer at the time usually managed only about 10 to 15 jugera of land. But the large Gracchian farms needed much more labor. Since many local farmers had disappeared and the land had been unused for years, these new owners likely relied on slaves to work their land. We don't find many fancy Roman villas in the area, so it's likely that most owners lived in cities like Utica, while their estates were managed by slave overseers. This was a unique region that followed the jus Italicum system, meaning the land was private and free from taxes, similar to land in Italy. Very few areas in the provinces had this status. Another nearby area, about 25 miles by 25 miles wide and west of the old Gracchian colony, had a similar story. It was located between the towns of Vaga and Thuga, along the Bagradus River. Though the land was rocky and hard to farm, it got more rain than Carthage and was better suited for crops. Originally, this area belonged to King Massinissa of Numidia, but Carthaginian landowners had already improved it by clearing and planting it. Later, the Numidians continued farming there successfully. During the Jugurthine War, Roman generals Metellus and Marius fought in this region and found it very prosperous. Marius had promised land to his soldiers, and he likely planned to give them this land. After the war, his ally Saturninus passed a law to distribute land in Africa to Marius' veterans. This seems to be the area he meant, since towns like Uchi-Maius and Tiberius later took the name Colonia Mariana, showing a link to Marius. Future digs will likely find more such evidence in other towns. Though ancient sources don't say it clearly, This region was probably added to the Roman province of Africa around the same time. We can trace the new border running south from Thabraca, east of towns like Bulla Regia and Sica. So the land between the old and new borders can be seen as the Marian territory. Interestingly, Marius organized his settlers not into Roman-style cities, but into rural townships, just like earlier settlers in Campania after 211 BC. These settlers were mostly Italian farmers. Many towns in the area, such as Uci, Thuga, and Thignica, had both native village communities and separate Roman settler communities, showing this dual structure. This rural organization allowed Roman settlers to work closely with local villagers. The locals already knew how to farm and were adapted to the land, so the Romans didn't need to rely heavily on slave labor. This created a unique type of villa system that was very different from the large estates of the Gracchian colonies, which were worked mostly by slaves. We don't know exactly how many soldiers received land here, but since they had seen how rich the area was, many probably chose to settle. If each man got 100 jugera, over 5,000 could have been given land in that 25 by 25 mile area. The land was likely granted fully, without rent or taxes, just like land in Italy. The remaining local people had to pay a crop tax, usually 1/8 of what they grew. Later, during the Roman Empire, this area became famous for having huge estates. Because the land was tax-free and labor was readily available, it was natural for large farms to grow. Although Marius had given land to small farmers, over time some likely failed due to changing conditions. They might have sold their land or become tenants for wealthier settlers. In time, big estates took over smaller ones. Since there wasn't a big city nearby, successful landowners usually lived on their farms. They used their personal slaves to grow crops for themselves and rented out the rest of the land to local farmers. If they became richer, they might move to Carthage or Rome and leave a manager or trusted tenant in charge. This tenant would work the owner's land and also collect rent from others. This system, using local managers instead of just slaves, was different from typical Roman farming and has confused historians. But when we look at the background and the practical needs of the region, it actually makes perfect sense. So there were two special areas in Roman Africa, the Gracchian and the Marian tracts, where land could be privately owned without paying taxes, just like in Italy. This was rare in the rest of the Roman Empire. Because of these benefits, Roman investors found these lands extremely attractive, and soon, owning an estate in Africa became a symbol of wealth. On the Marian land especially, a system of tenant farming developed. This was made easier because many local people were already available to rent the land, as seen in many official records from the empire. Outside of these two tracts, most of the African province wasn't considered very important during the Republic. Much of the farmland was controlled by old Punic cities, and the villages in the hills paid their taxes directly to the Roman government without needing tax collectors. It wasn't until Julius Caesar rebuilt Carthage and took control of Numidia that Africa began to be viewed as a major province of the empire. As for Spain, more will be said later. During the 2nd century BC, Sicily was not a major concern for Rome, except for one thing. It sent around 1 million bushels of grain each year to feed Rome. Much of this grain went to the Roman armies. Since farms in Italy weren't producing enough to support the growing city of Rome, this import helped but didn't cause major problems. Roman businessmen didn't rush to invest in Sicily at first. One reason was that the usual Roman tax-collecting companies didn't operate there. Another reason was that better land, without taxes, was available in the Po Valley in northern Italy, which was more appealing to settlers. Also, Roman law at the time hadn't yet established the idea that all provincial land belonged to the state. So not even the reformer Gracchus tried to claim Sicilian land for new colonies. Instead, native landlords, mostly Greeks and a few former Carthaginians, kept building up large estates. They used more and more slaves to farm these lands, which eventually led to the devastating slave revolts. These uprisings ruined crops and killed many slaves, causing serious losses for the landowners. During the chaotic years of social and civil wars in Italy, some Greeks from southern Italy moved into Sicily and replaced some of the local landowners who had gone bankrupt. Evidence of this appears in names found in Cicero's speeches against Verres, Roman citizens and business people with Greek names. By the year 70 BC, when Cicero spoke out against Verres, most of Sicily's farmland was still being used for growing grain. Rome was even buying a second and third round of taxes from Sicily's grain, which helped keep grain prices high. Despite the heavy tax burden, Roman citizens had started buying or renting land on the island. Others got involved in trade or took tax contracts. Cicero's letters from the mid-1st century BC show that more and more Romans were settling there. However, grain farming has its limits, especially when done over and over again. By the time of Caesar and the early Roman Empire, Sicily was no longer known for grain. The topsoil had likely worn out, and landowners had to shift to other farming methods. They turned to growing fruits and vegetables, which use deeper soil layers, and to raising animals, which prevents soil erosion and gives the land time to recover, just as happened in other overused farming areas of the empire. After Gracchus died, fear of a civil war calmed both political sides for a while, especially when dealing with laws inside Rome. The People's Assembly even agreed to forgive Consul Opimius, who had broken the Sempronian law by allowing the Senate to pass a special emergency order. In return, the Senate accepted several reforms linked to Gracchus's ideas, like the way Asia was governed, the system of government contracts, juries made up of wealthy equestrians, land handouts, and, unfortunately, free grain distributions. During the following period of compromise, the Senate passed several changes to the land laws. These laws were written in complex language, but were designed to include terms the Gracchus supporters wanted. The first such law allowed people to sell the land they had received. This was welcomed by many settlers. Their land was often located far away in rough, isolated areas. These plots weren't useful for growing grain or fruits because they were too far from the market, and they were too small for raising animals. Many settlers wanted the right to sell their land, and nearby senators, who already owned large farms, were happy to buy the land at low prices, especially if they could fully own it. A second law, made by a tribune around 118 BC, was also a compromise. It got rid of the Land Distribution Commission and officially recognized the current landholder's property as legal private property, as long as they paid a small tax, likely 1/10 of the harvest. This tax money was supposed to go to public programs, such as the free grain distributions. Most landholders agreed to this tax, as it protected them from losing their land in the future and meant no new land reforms would threaten them. Legal disputes could still happen, but now a Roman judge would handle them, not the People's Assembly. Later, in 111 BC, once the Senate felt securely in control, it passed a detailed land law that aimed to clear up confusion from previous laws. It confirmed all legal rights to land given under earlier laws and made them tax-free. It also kept some land in Campania as public property, confirmed road maintenance duties for landowners, upheld old government-backed loans made during the Second Punic War, and laid out rules for using shared grazing land. This law was meant to settle everything. However, the big landowners seemed to take too much advantage. 2 years later, during the public anger over how badly the Jugurthine War was managed, 5 tribunes passed a new law. This law included official land surveys, and created self-governing towns for the settlers, giving them the power to settle land boundary disputes. These communities included the large landowners too, and made them follow local town decisions. After this, land reform protests in Italy stopped for the time being. Even Marius, when he promised land to his soldiers, understood he had to look for land outside Italy, in places like Gaul, Sardinia, or Africa. From this point on, the struggle between the political parties became less constant, only flaring up when one side saw a good opportunity. The failure of conservative leaders in the Jugurthine War allowed the popular faction to push for Marius as the new general, ignoring the Senate's usual right to pick generals by random draw. Marius also broke with tradition by recruiting volunteers instead of using the draft. So in 108 BC, two important new traditions began that weakened the old Roman political system. Then, in 106 BC, the Senate tried to regain power over the courts. Wealthy equestrians had been using their control of the jury system to punish governors who tried to limit their tax profits in the provinces. It was easy to bring false charges against such governors, and with all-night juries, they had little chance of a fair trial. The Senate convinced the people that this was unfair, and a new law was passed allowing senators to also sit on these juries. However, the senator who pushed this reform, Caepio, failed badly in the Cimbrian War the next year. As a result, public opinion turned again, and the equestrians were able to bring back the old jury system, set up by the Sempronian laws. Thus, major changes to the Republic often depended on random turns of fate. It was likely the business class involved with trade in Asia that pushed for action in 103 BC to stop the growing threat of pirates. That year, the Democratic faction won the elections. Most pirates were based in Cilicia, a region in southern Asia Minor. Rome had taken control of the province of Asia, but hadn't bothered to govern the southern coast properly. Rhodes, once a strong naval power, was no longer able to stop the pirates. Meanwhile, Rome had been busy with wars in North Africa and against the Germanic tribes, and King Mithridates of Pontus sometimes hired these pirates for attacks in the Black Sea. Before this time, few Romans traded by sea, but things changed when Roman tax contractors began collecting taxes in the form of produce, which had to be shipped. These traders wanted protection for their goods, even if they used foreign ships. So a Roman named Antonius was sent with a fleet to clean up the eastern Mediterranean. He succeeded, and Cilicia was made an official Roman province, meaning it came under permanent military control. Sea travel stayed safe until the social war later forced Rome to bring its troops back home. The political violence of Saturninus and Glaucia between 103 to 101 BC was more about personal ambition than real economic concerns. They copied the ideas of Gracchus to gain power. Even Marius, a major general, grew frustrated with the false promises made in exchange for support. He eventually sided with the Senate and accepted the authority of a senatus consultum ultimum, a decree giving the Senate emergency powers. By 90 BC, after 50 years of failed attempts to gain Roman citizenship, the Italian Sabellic tribes declared independence. They set up their own republican government, built an army, and asked other Italian peoples to join them, though few did. These tribes had many complaints. They were forced to fight in Rome's wars without gaining any of the rewards. No citizenship, no share in the money or food Rome gave to its own citizens, and no access to important jobs or honors. They were also excluded from all land reforms. Worst of all, they were no longer treated with respect as equals. Over time, leaders like Gracchus and Drusus had tried to get these tribes Roman citizenship, even risking their lives for it. But the Roman people, who feared losing their influence if more people got the vote, always rejected these efforts. Some senators did support the idea, and giving citizenship had even been part of aristocratic policy in earlier times. But now that it was linked with Gracchus's name, hated by conservatives, many senators opposed it, using party loyalty as their excuse. The equestrian class was also mostly against the idea. Some may have feared losing profits from government contracts if rich Italians joined their ranks, but we don't have clear evidence of this. The social war broke out when these tribes finally rebelled. Rome crushed the rebellion within 2 years, but only by promising citizenship to all Italians up to the river Po. However, when the war ended, Rome grouped all the new citizens into just 10 voting districts, making it almost impossible for their votes to influence elections. Although most Italians didn't care much about voting in Rome, they were furious at this betrayal. A tribune named Sulpicius spoke out for them and proposed a new law, that Italians be evenly spread across all 35 voting districts. The Roman people didn't care much about the issue until Marius agreed to support the law in exchange for being given command in the war against Mithridates, which had just started. The people passed the law. However, Sulla, a consul and legal commander of the army, declared Marius's appointment illegal. He marched his troops into Rome, claiming to protect the constitution, and had Marius, Sulpicius, and their allies declared enemies of the state. After that, he left to fight in the east. Marius escaped, returned with help from the Italians, seized control of Rome, and took revenge by ordering many of his enemies killed. Even though his faction now controlled the city and had officially recognized the Italians as citizens, they didn't speed up their enrollment into the voting system. 4 years later, Sulla came back victorious from the east. He carried out another mass killing of political enemies and took land from communities that had opposed him. His pacification campaign devastated areas like Samnium and Etruria, where hatred of his betrayal was strongest. When Sulla rewrote the constitution to favor the aristocracy, he removed the office of censor, which handled the registration of citizens, effectively blocking the new citizens from voting. At that time, there were probably about 2 million Italian citizens who should have been eligible to vote, but the official count in 85 BC listed only 390,000. No new registrations were made until Sulla's system was overturned in 70 BC. Some say the civil war between Marius and Sulla was just a continuation of the social war. But it's more accurate to say the social war happened because political systems had become stuck due to civil conflict. And that conflict eventually pulled all of Italy into a long and bitter struggle between opposing political factions. The social and civil wars brought little real benefit. The strong farming communities of the Samnites and Martians suffered greatly. Large ranches started to spread into areas where, before, small-scale hillside farming had supported healthy, active communities. Sulla gave some of his soldiers land in places like Etruria and Campania. But these men were not prepared for farming. They had spent 10 harsh years fighting in Italy and Asia, not learning how to work the land. In some areas, large estates were broken up into small farms again, which wasn't a bad idea by itself. However, as seen in the town of Praeneste, after just 20 years, the wealthy landowners had regained control. Many people who had lost their land in Campania turned to robbery and piracy. Others fled to Africa and Spain and joined rebel armies that Pompey later had to defeat. Those who stayed behind in Italy became part of the angry mob that followed Catiline in his later revolt. Under Sulla's rule, power and property shifted from one group of families to another. He didn't just kill his enemies, he also took their lands and sold them, leaving their families poor and powerless. Sulla's conservative political system lasted only 8 years after his death. It might not have even lasted that long if the equestrian class hadn't been weakened by Sulla's purges. In 71 BC, Pompey and Crassus, both connected to wealthy landowners, ran for consul with a plan to limit the Senate's power. They promised to bring back the powers of the tribunes, allow knights to sit on juries with senators, improve governance in the provinces, and bring back the office of censor. This last promise was especially important. It aimed to register many Italians who hadn't yet been officially recorded as citizens, and to make tax collection more efficient. After they won the elections, Pompey and Crassus kept their promises. The older, more democratic constitution was mostly restored. However, one major reform was left out: installing ballot boxes in Italian towns for national elections. That one change could have made Italy truly united as a political body. Even in Julius Caesar's time, local officials in Italian towns were allowed to register citizens, but they were not allowed to run national elections. This shows how strongly even democratic leaders wanted to keep political power centered around the city of Rome. With the return of some stability, the business class felt confident enough to ask for help. Piracy had become a serious threat again, first in the east, encouraged by Mithridates, and later in the west as well, worsened by the lawlessness during the civil wars. In 76 to 75 BC, a Roman commander named Servilius destroyed some pirate bases in Cilicia, but the seas were still unsafe. The Senate did nothing, so a politician named Gabinius proposed a law giving Pompey the power to build a massive fleet and defeat the pirates. The Senate opposed it, claiming it was unconstitutional, and even found a tribune to block the bill. But the knights used a political trick once used by Gracchus, getting the public assembly to remove the tribune. The bill passed, and Pompey quickly did the job. Pompey also saw that the pirates were a result of government failure, so instead of just punishing them, he settled them in new towns and turned them into farmers, a practical and humane solution. Pompey's success led the knights to push for him to lead the war against Mithridates. The current general, Lucullus, was unpopular. He had been too harsh with Asian debtors and too strict with his own soldiers, who were close to mutiny. Pompey, on the other hand, was popular with the knights. He had already helped them with his reforms in 70 BC, and by clearing the seas. He had also made Cilicia into a province, showing he supported expanding Rome's territories, which meant more business opportunities. The knights trusted Pompey to win the war and open new regions, like Bithynia and Syria, for trade and contracts. They were sure he wouldn't act like Sulla, who taxed heavily through Senate officials, or like Lucullus, who had tried to protect local people by canceling debts to Roman lenders. If the Senate had finished the war, they would likely have followed their old plan, creating only modest tax-paying provinces managed by Senate-appointed officials. But with Pompey in charge, things would be different. A tribune introduced a bill giving Pompey command. It was strongly supported by Cicero, the best speaker of the time. Cicero had served under Pompey's father and admired Pompey since then. Having grown up during Sulla's rule, Cicero supported a more democratic government. He also didn't fully understand how corrupt the tax contract system could be at its worst. Pompey got the command and lived up to expectations. He made Bithynia, Cilicia, and Syria into tax-paying provinces like Asia. He added Pontus to Bithynia and reorganized Galatia and Cappadocia as smaller kingdoms that still paid taxes to Rome. Armenia remained independent and tax-free, but acted as a friendly buffer state. In this region, there were also many small temple states and minor kings who were allowed to keep their positions but were placed under Roman protection and had to pay tribute. The income from these new areas nearly doubled the Roman government's yearly revenue. Pompey's decisions in organizing the new provinces mostly focused on collecting revenue. During his victory parade, he displayed a plaque listing 39 cities he claimed to have founded. Historians have debated whether this showed a deliberate policy to promote city life. However, it's unclear if Pompey truly believed in urban development for its own sake. If we look at the different areas he reorganized, we see that he built cities based on local needs. For example, in the province of Asia, where there were many rural farmers, he didn't create new cities. Nor did he interfere in Galatia, which was run effectively by its local rulers, or in Lycia, which had a stable local government. But in the wild, undeveloped region of Pontus, Pompey divided the area into 11 districts. If a district didn't already have a suitable town to serve as its center, he either built a new one or upgraded a village. These new towns included marketplaces and public buildings, and locals were encouraged to move there, so that the towns would grow strong and generate revenue. Pompey's real aim was practical, to build centers for administration, trade, and especially tax collection. This made it easier for Roman tax contractors to collect money efficiently and fairly. These new cities were added to the province of Bithynia, which already had a tradition of self-governed towns. In Cappadocia, things were different. The kingdom had been destroyed by Mithridates, and 300,000 of its people had been taken away to Armenia. Pompey had to help them return and settle them safely. The local king, Ariobarzanes, was left in charge but needed help rebuilding his kingdom. Pompey even loaned him money at high interest to get things running again. The goal was to build towns that were safe, encouraged farming and trade, and supported the king's ability to collect tribute for Rome. Syria presented even more challenges. In earlier times, the Seleucid kings had focused on building cities to collect taxes directly from urban areas instead of from scattered farms. But when their power faded, the region fell apart. Arab tribes and desert nomads overran towns, Jewish leaders took control of Greek cities in Palestine, and people abandoned farming for a wandering life. The Romans, like the early Seleucid kings, tried to stop this breakdown by building or restoring stable urban centers. These towns made it easier for Rome to collect taxes and stopped money from being lost to small-time local rulers or tribal chiefs. Pompey likely wasn't thinking much about culture or spreading Roman values. His goal was practical: create safe, tax-paying towns that made the empire run better. Still, thanks to his reforms, these new communities were better protected from exploitation by Roman tax collectors than those in the older province of Asia. Some historians have claimed that Pompey treated all the royal crown lands of defeated kings as Roman state land. But this seems unlikely. While he did seize the personal property and palaces of kings in Bithynia, Pontus, and Syria, and turned them over to Rome, he left the large areas of farmland, traditionally called crown land in the east, under the control of the local farmers and communities. These lands were treated as private farmland that had to pay tribute but weren't taken from the people. We see this in Cicero's speech against the Rulan Land Bill in 63 BC. That bill proposed selling public land in the provinces to raise money to buy land for poor Romans in Italy. When Cicero lists public lands, he mentions only a few specific places: public lands in Sicily, lands taken from pirates in Cilicia, royal lands in Macedonia, and some other properties, like the sites of destroyed cities such as Corinth and Carthage. But he doesn't mention large areas of land in the new eastern provinces. He only lists a few royal estates in places like Paphlagonia, Pontus, Cappadocia, and Bithynia. This shows that the term ager regius referred only to the personal property of kings, not all farmland taxed by those kings. If Pompey had treated all taxed land as public land, the Rulan Bill would have been proposing to sell more land than existed in all of Italy. So it's clear that in the east, Pompey and the Roman government left most farmland with the local landowners and farmers. They only took over the private estates of the deposed kings. The cities and villages continued to own and farm their land as before, though now they paid taxes to Rome. Only the former royal properties were handed over to Roman officials in charge of public land. It's interesting that Pompey's efforts to help the business class, especially the equestrian tax companies, ended up working against him. By 61 BC, these tax companies had become so powerful that they united to pressure the Senate into canceling a third of the taxes they had agreed to pay, claiming poor harvests in Asia. The Senate refused. In response, Caesar promised to cancel that debt if he became consul, and once elected, he kept his promise. This gave wealthy investors the freedom to take advantage of the provinces for the next 10 years. So when Pompey later broke with Caesar and sided with the Senate, Caesar had already secured the loyalty of many wealthy knights, which helped him during the Civil War. While Pompey was still in the east, a serious conspiracy led by Catiline broke out in Rome. It threatened the stability of the Republic. The movement wasn't entirely driven by poverty, although its leaders pretended to be reformers. There were certainly many unhappy people who were ready for change. But the solution Catiline offered, redistributing land, was actually one of the causes of the very problems he claimed to want to fix. Catiline found supporters in places like northern Etruria and Picenum, where Sulla had taken land from supporters of Marius and downgraded them to a lesser legal status. These were likely the people Sallust said had lost their citizenship. Many of Sulla's own former soldiers, who had been given this land, had failed as farmers and were now hoping for a second chance through more land redistribution. But the real roots of Italy's troubles were not caused by the current government, and another civil war was not the solution. Rome usually handled such problems with things like sending people to settle in the provinces, giving free grain to the poor, and simply letting time heal the wounds. These methods probably would have worked again. Catiline also hoped for support from other groups: displaced Marians from Praeneste, slave shepherds working on massive estates in the south, and the urban poor surviving on free grain handouts. But in reality, very few of them were willing to fight for a new government. When Catiline finally faced Roman forces, he had only about 3,000 followers. The truth is, there wasn't a serious economic crisis. Things were actually better than they had been since Sulla's bloody campaigns across Italy 20 years earlier. The tension was more political than economic. Both the Senate and the people realized that they couldn't both be in charge of the Republic, and that only force would decide whether Rome would be ruled by a democracy or an aristocracy. There was also fear that Pompey, upon returning from the east, would use his army to take power, just as Sulla had done years before. The Senate rushed to strengthen its position, afraid Pompey might support the popular party. Meanwhile, younger democratic leaders like Crassus and Caesar tried to take full control of their side before Pompey returned and took the lead. Behind all this fear and urgency was the memory of how Marius and Sulla had used their armies to change Rome by force. The real cause of the growing conflict was the unwillingness of both sides to compromise, and the dangerous precedents set by Sulla. Catiline himself was less of a real reformer and more of a foolish puppet used by powerful men who planned to get rid of him once he served his purpose. His lack of intelligence and selfish motives were revealed in a letter he wrote to a Roman noble, Catulus. "Angry over the insults and mistreatment I've received, because I was denied the rewards for my efforts and failed to win an important office, I've chosen to support the poor, not because I'm too deep in debt, but because I see unworthy men being given honors." This shows that Catiline wasn't driven by justice or public good. He was simply bitter that someone like Cicero, a new man without noble blood, had become consul while he, a patrician, had failed. After this failed uprising, the Senate responded harshly, believing they had broad public support, but they overplayed their hand and misused their power. Julius Caesar took advantage of their mistakes, won a powerful military command, and eventually used it to become Rome's ruler. The Romans were practical and efficient when it came to managing their personal finances. But when it came to managing public money, their efficiency often failed, just like in many democracies. This was due to pressure from friends wanting favors, unstable government policies that changed often, poor oversight, and the public's tendency to elect likable rather than competent officials. Ironically, some of the Eastern kings whom the Romans replaced were better administrators. These kings treated their kingdoms like personal property, so they hired skilled managers, removed failures, and kept experienced officials in their positions. This created a reliable and efficient government. In contrast, the Roman system believed that any man from a good family could hold any public office. A typical Roman political career looked like this. A young man might begin as a treasury officer for 1 year. After a break, if the voters approved of him, he could become an aedile, managing public works, and usually then gained a lifetime seat in the Senate. After another break, he might become a judge, even if he had no legal training. In fact, one reason Roman civil law stayed practical and fair was that these judges were ordinary men using common sense, and juries were made up of people like themselves. But while this system worked for civil cases, it didn't do a good job in handling crime or enforcing criminal law. After being a judge, a man might spend a year governing a small province. If he remained popular, he could then be elected as consul, the highest office in Rome, for a year. After that, he could be appointed to govern a major province, and then return to Rome to become a senior senator helping shape imperial policies. This process gave Roman officials broad experience, but they rarely became experts in anything. They often learned through trial and error, making mistakes in jobs they weren't trained for, and moving on before they truly understood the role. While this system created well-rounded senators, it didn't produce good administrators. In Rome's early days, this didn't cause major problems. The city was small, and citizens could see how public money was spent. But once Rome started ruling distant provinces, these inexperienced officials could cause great damage. The notorious corruption of Verus, a Roman governor in Sicily, is a well-known example. In the early Republic, national expenses were very low. Elected officials served 1-year terms without being paid. Winning an election was considered such an honor that people were happy to serve for free. The army was also unpaid. Only landowners were called to serve, and they were motivated to defend their homes and property. Wealthier soldiers paid for their own weapons and armor. Public projects, like building city walls, were done by the citizen soldiers as part of their duty. Roads were maintained by local property owners. Many temples were built using money from war loot. These few items covered almost all of the early state's needs. At that time, Rome still resembled a tribal society, only working together when physical defense was necessary. Moral, educational, and social matters were left to families and individuals.